The rain fell in heavy sheets drumming against the weathered planks of Clayton Harrow's cabin. Located at the edge of Copper Creek, far enough from prying eyes, the small structure stood hunched against the darkness like a guilty secret. The storm offered a perfect cover for his work. No one would venture out on such a night. Clayton's shovel bit into the sodden earth behind his cabin, each thrust accompanied by his labored breathing. The hole was nearly deep enough now. Moonlight broke through a momentary gap in the clouds, casting his face in a ghastly silver glow. Sweat mingled with rainwater on his brow, despite the autumn chill. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, darted nervously toward the tree line. "No one can know," he muttered, his words swallowed by thunder. "No one." The bundle, wrapped in a blood-stained sheet, lay beside the hole, rain slowly washing away crimson evidence that pooled beneath it. Clayton paused, leaning on his shovel, and took a long pull from the whiskey bottle protruding from his coat pocket. The liquor burned a familiar path down his throat, steadying his nerves. With the grave finished, he rolled the bundle in, averting his eyes, as a pale hand fell free from the wrapping. He quickly shoveled dirt over it, burying not just a body but evidence of his latest transgression. When the last spadeful of earth had been tamped down, Clayton staggered back toward his cabin, unaware of the eyes watching him from the darkness. 3 days later, the Golden Nugget Saloon squatted on the corner of Copper Creek's main street like a toad, its windows glowing dimly in the late afternoon light. The rain had passed, but the town remained draped in a gray shroud of lingering mist. Inside, the air hung thick with smoke, cheap perfume, and desperation, the universal scent of places where men came to forget. Samuel Blackwood pushed through the bat-wing doors, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the sawdust-strewn floor. At 40, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. A trimmed salt-and-pepper beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled. Eyes the color of gunmetal surveyed the room with the calculated assessment of someone accustomed to cataloging threats. He made his way to the bar boots, leaving muddy imprints behind him. The patrons, miners, cowboys, and men of indeterminate profession barely glanced up from their drinks. Newcomers weren't uncommon in Copper Creek, a town where the railroad had promised prosperity but delivered only false hope and broken dreams. "Whiskey," Samuel said to the bartender, placing a coin on the scarred wooden surface. "And information." The bartender, a barrel-chested man, with arms like tree trunks, and a face that had absorbed the stories of 1,000 drunks, slid a glass toward him and filled it with amber liquid. "Depends on what kind of information," he replied, voice low and gravelly. "And how much it's worth to you." Samuel knocked back the whiskey in one swallow, feeling it burn away some of the trail dust that seemed to have settled in his throat. "I'm looking for work. And a room. Got rooms upstairs. $2 a week paid in advance." The bartender refilled Samuel's glass without being asked. "As for work, not much to be had unless you're willing to go down in the mines. Even those are drying up faster than a puddle in July." Samuel nodded, sliding another coin across the bar. "The room will do for now." "You got a name? Stranger. Blackwood. Samuel Blackwood." The bartender's eyes narrowed slightly as if testing the name for truth. "Bart Simmons," he offered in return. "I run this establishment. You break anything you pay for it. You cause trouble. You answer to me before the sheriff gets involved. We understand each other." Samuel nodded, picking up his glass. "Perfectly. Room 3 at the top of the stairs. It ain't fancy, but it's got a bed and a lock on the door." Samuel thanked him with a slight nod and turned to survey the saloon more carefully. In his decade of drifting, he'd seen 100 places just like this, watering holes where men washed away their sorrows and mistakes with cheap liquor, where women with painted faces and dead eyes sold companionship by the hour, where fortunes changed hands over cards and dice. He chose a table in the corner, with a clear view of both the entrance and the stairs leading to the rooms above. Old habits died hard. After 10 years, he still couldn't bear to sit with his back to a door. As the evening progressed, Samuel nursed his drinks, watching and listening. Copper Creek revealed itself through fragments of conversation, complaints about the mine owners cutting wages again, gossip about the mayor's wife running off with a traveling salesman, speculation about whether the railroad would ever extend the line as promised. But Samuel was listening for specific names, specific connections. His presence in Copper Creek was no accident. The trail he'd been following for years had led him here, a trail of missing children, of broken families, of whispered rumors about people who procured special merchandise for wealthy clients back east. A trail that might finally lead him to the men responsible for destroying his life. 10 years ago, Samuel Blackwood had been a different man, a railway detective with a reputation for solving cases others couldn't, with a beautiful wife named Catherine and a 5-year-old son, William. They had lived in a modest but comfortable house near the Denver station, Catherine teaching at the local school, while Samuel worked the rails, tracking down thieves and con men who preyed on the railway and its passengers. Then came the case that changed everything. Reports of children disappearing along the western routes, not runaways, but calculated abductions. Samuel had been assigned to investigate, and the trail had led him to a sophisticated operation, children being transported across state lines for purposes that turned his stomach. He'd been close, so close to breaking it open when the fire happened. Samuel had been in Utah following a lead when the telegram reached him. Fire at the Denver station. Catherine and William had been waiting to surprise him on his expected return. Neither survived. By the time Samuel made it back to Denver, there was nothing left but ashes and 2 fresh graves. The official report called it an accident. A lamp knocked over, coal oil spilled, but Samuel knew better. It had been a warning, a message: back off or lose everything. He'd been too blind to see it coming, too confident in his own abilities. The investigation was reassigned. Samuel resigned his position, descended into a bottle, and began a decade-long odyssey of guilt and self-destruction. But underneath the grief and alcohol, a cold flame of vengeance continued to burn. Slowly, methodically, he gathered information, following whispers and rumors, building a map of the organization that had taken everything from him. All roads had led to Copper Creek. Samuel was on his second day at the Golden Nugget when he first noticed her, a small figure flitting through the saloon, like a shadow, carrying trays, emptying spittoons, sweeping the floors. A girl of perhaps 11 or 12, painfully thin, with auburn hair tied back in a messy braid. Her dress, though clean, was patched and too short at the ankles, suggesting it had been handed down or purchased second-hand. But it was her eyes that caught Samuel's attention, large, luminous, and far too old for her young face. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things no child should witness, who carried burdens no child should bear. She worked efficiently, avoiding the hands that occasionally reached out to grab at her, navigating the crowded room with the wariness of prey in predator territory. Samuel watched her over the rim of his glass, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct he thought had died with his son. "Who's the girl?" he asked Bart when the bartender brought him another drink. Bart glanced over his shoulder. "That's Emma. Works for Clayton Harrow. Does odd jobs around town to help make ends meet. Seems young to be working in a place like this." Bart's expression hardened. "Lot of things in this town ain't right, Mr. Blackwood. That's just one of them. Best to mind your own business if you plan on staying." Samuel nodded, but his eyes followed Emma as she disappeared into the back of the saloon. There was something about her, something beyond the obvious tragedy of a child working in a saloon. Something in those eyes that seemed to hold secrets. It was later that evening, as Samuel sat playing a half-hearted game of solitaire, that he heard a cry from the alley behind the saloon, high-pitched and desperate, quickly muffled but unmistakably a child in distress. Several patrons glanced toward the back door, then deliberately returned to their drinks, their faces carefully blank. Bart wiped down the bar with greater concentration than necessary. Samuel rose from his chair, the scrape of wood against floorboards drawing a few nervous glances. He moved toward the back door, aware of the sudden tension in the room. As he passed the bar, Bart caught his arm. "Leave it be," the bartender muttered. "Harrow don't take kindly to interference where the girl's concerned." Maud gently but firmly removed Bart's hand. "Noted," he said, and continued toward the door. The night air hit him like a slap after the stuffy warmth of the saloon. The alley behind the Golden Nugget was narrow and filthy, reeking of garbage and human waste. A single lantern hanging from a hook cast just enough light to illuminate the scene before him. Emma knelt on the ground frantically, trying to gather potatoes that had spilled from an overturned bucket. Above her stood a man tall and broad-shouldered, with a face flushed from drink, and something darker, more dangerous. Clayton Harrow Samuel presumed. In his hand, he held a lit cigarette, its ember glowing menacingly in the dim light. "Clumsy little wretch," Harrow snarled, words slurring slightly. "That's a week's worth of potatoes now covered in filth. Maybe a little fire will teach you to be more careful." He lowered the cigarette toward Emma's exposed forearm. The girl didn't scream or try to run. Instead, she looked up at him with those ancient eyes in her young face and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me?" The resignation in her voice, the complete lack of surprise or protest, hit Samuel like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time he realized. This child had endured this torment before, perhaps many times. "I don't think that's going to happen," Samuel said, stepping fully into the circle of lantern light. Harrow spun around, cigarette still burning between his fingers. Up close, Samuel could see the network of broken blood vessels across his nose and cheeks, the yellow stains on his teeth, and the momentary flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he assessed the newcomer. "This ain't none of your business, stranger," Harrow growled, but there was a note of wariness in his voice now. "The girl's mine to discipline as I see fit. Is that what you call it?" Samuel took another step forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Where I come from, we have a different word for men who burn children." Emma had pressed herself against the wall, still clutching a few salvaged potatoes to her chest. Her eyes darted between the two men, wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked almost like recognition as she stared at Samuel. "You best walk away," Harrow said, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. "This don't concern you." "I'm making it my concern." Samuel hadn't touched the revolver holstered at his hip, but his stance had shifted subtly, weight balanced, ready to move. What followed was brief, but decisive. Harrow lunged with the knife, a clumsy attack, fueled by alcohol and rage. Samuel sidestepped, caught Harrow's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground. A quick knee to the stomach doubled Harrow over, and a precise blow to the jaw sent him sprawling in the dirt. Samuel kicked the knife away into the shadows, then crouched to Harrow's level. "If I hear you've laid another hand on her," he said quietly, "we'll finish what we started here, and next time you won't get up. Understand?" Harrow spat blood onto the ground but nodded, hatred burning in his eyes. Only then did Samuel turn his attention to Emma. who was watching the entire scene with an expression that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite hope, but somewhere in the unsettling territory between. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching down to her level and keeping his voice gentle. She shook her head, still clutching those precious potatoes. "What's your name?" "Emma," she whispered, glancing quickly at Harrow, who was struggling to his feet, one hand pressed to his jaw. "Well, Emma, I'm Samuel, and I think maybe you and I should have a talk." Harrow staggered forward. "She comes home with me," he snarled, though there was little conviction in his voice. "Your responsibility." Samuel stood slowly, letting his full height serve as a reminder of who had won their brief encounter. "You forfeited any claim to responsibility when you decided to use a lit cigarette as a teaching tool." He turned back to Emma. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. Finally, she shrugged a gesture that tried to appear casual, but couldn't hide the profound sadness behind it. "I eat," she said, but the way she said it told him everything he needed to know about the quality and quantity of those meals. "Would you like to join me for dinner? There's a boarding house down the street that serves decent food." Hope flickered in Emma's eyes, quickly replaced by caution. "He'll be angry?" she said, though they both knew Harrow would be angry regardless. "Let me worry about him," Samuel replied, extending his hand. "Tonight, you're going to eat a real meal. Tomorrow, we can figure out what comes next." Emma stared at his outstretched hand, conflict evident in her young features. Trust did not come easily to a child who had learned that adults were often the source of her greatest pain. But hunger was a powerful motivator, and finally she placed her small, dirt-stained hand in his. As they walked away, Samuel could feel Harrow's eyes burning into his back. He'd made an enemy tonight, he knew, but looking down at the small figure beside him, he found he didn't care. What he didn't notice was the way Emma studied his face in the moonlight, or the way she whispered something to herself that sounded like, just like she said. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood in stark contrast to the Golden Nugget. Clean, well-maintained, with curtains in the windows and flowers in boxes on the porch. It represented the respectable side of Copper Creek, the side that still clung to the hope of the town becoming something more than a failed mining venture. The proprietress herself was a widow in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She raised an eyebrow at Samuel and Emma's appearance, but asked no questions as she led them to a small table in the corner of the dining room. "Special tonight is beef stew," she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Comes with biscuits and greens." "Two, please," Samuel said, noting how Emma's eyes widened at the prospect. When Mrs. Patterson had gone to the kitchen, Emma leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, and one Samuel wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why had he intervened? Why had this particular child in this particular town pierced the armor of indifference he'd constructed over a decade of wandering? "No child deserves to be treated that way," he said finally. Emma studied him with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. "You're not telling the whole truth," she said simply. Before Samuel could respond, Mrs. Patterson returned with 2 bowls of stew, the aroma rich and savory. Emma's focus immediately shifted to the food before her, though she waited until Samuel had taken his first bite before picking up her own spoon. She ate with the careful deliberation of someone who had known real hunger, not the temporary discomfort of a missed meal, but the gnawing emptiness that came from chronic deprivation. She took small, measured bites, chewing thoroughly, occasionally glancing up, as if to make sure the food wasn't going to be taken away. Samuel found himself fighting a rising tide of anger. How long had this child been suffering? And how many people in this town had looked the other way? "How long have you lived with Mr. Harrow?" he asked when Emma had finished half her bowl. She paused, considering. 3 years, I think, since Mama died. And he's your stepfather? Emma nodded, dropping her gaze to the stew. He married Mama when I was 8. She died 6 months later. There was a story there Samuel sensed one Emma wasn't ready to tell. He didn't press. And he makes you work at the saloon. And other places, Emma said. I clean for Mrs. Patterson sometimes, and help at the general store. Mr. Harrow takes most of what I earn, but Mrs. Patterson slips me extra bread sometimes. The matter-of-fact way she described her exploitation made Samuel's jaw clench. Child labor wasn't uncommon in frontier towns, but this went beyond a family needing all hands to survive. This was systematic abuse. They finished their meal in relative silence. When the last of the stew had been sopped up with biscuits, Emma looked more relaxed than Samuel had seen her, though wariness still lurked in her eyes. Thank you, she said formally, as if uncertain of the proper protocol for receiving kindness. I should get back now. If I'm too late, You're not going back there tonight. Samuel interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Patterson has rooms. You'll stay here. Fear flashed across Emma's face. He won't allow it. I'm not asking his permission. Mrs. Patterson, who had been clearing nearby tables, approached with a coffee pot. Everything satisfactory? She asked, refilling Samuel's cup. The food was excellent, Samuel replied. I wonder if you might have a room available for the young lady tonight. Mrs. Patterson's eyes flicked to Emma, then back to Samuel, her expression calculating. That depends, she said carefully, on whose authority I'd be keeping her. Mine for tonight, Samuel said. Beyond that, we'll see. The older woman studied him for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. Room at the top of the stairs is free, $5 including breakfast. It was twice what the room was worth, but Samuel paid without comment. Mrs. Patterson pocketed the money and turned to Emma. Come along, child. Let's get you a bath and some clean clothes. I've got a nightgown might fit you with a bit of pinning. Emma hesitated, looking to Samuel with uncertainty. Go on, he encouraged. Get some rest. I'll be here in the morning. As Mrs. Patterson led Emma away, the girl glanced back over her shoulder, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she expected to wake from a dream at any moment. Left alone, Samuel sipped his coffee, considering his next steps. Interfering with Harrow's treatment of Emma hadn't been part of his plan in Copper Creek. He'd come to gather information to confirm connections to get closer to the men who had orchestrated his family's murder. Getting involved with a mistreated child was a complication he hadn't anticipated. And yet, there was something about Emma that tugged at him, something beyond the obvious parallels to the cases of child exploitation he'd investigated years ago. Something in those knowing eyes that seemed to see right through him. Mrs. Patterson returned a while later, sliding into the chair opposite Samuel with the confidence of a woman on her own territory. That child's been half-starved for months, she said without preamble, and the bruises on her back didn't come from falling downstairs, whatever she might say. Samuel nodded, unsurprised, but still angered by the confirmation. Clayton Harrow's a mean drunk, and a meaner sober man, Mrs. Patterson continued. Been that way since his family burned up in that cabin fire years back. But taking it out on a child, she shook her head in disgust. Town should have stepped in long ago. Why didn't they? Mrs. Patterson's mouth twisted. Sheriff Morrison owes Harrow for covering gambling debts. Pastor Wilkes doesn't want to upset the natural order of a man's authority in his household. And the rest? She shrugged. Easier to look away than to get involved. You're the first stranger who's bothered. And you? Samuel asked quietly. Why didn't you step in? A flash of shame crossed the older woman's face. I've helped where I could. Extra food. A warm place to sit when it's cold. But I'm a widow, running a business on slim margins in a dying town. She met his eyes defiantly. I'm not proud of it, but there it is. Samuel nodded, understanding the complicated calculations of survival on the frontier. What can you tell me about Harrow beyond his drinking? Keeps to himself mostly. Cabin out past the edge of town. Does odd jobs but never seems short of money despite the drinking. Some say he runs errands for men who pass through on the stage. Don't know what kind of errands, but they pay well enough. Men who pass through regularly. Mrs. Patterson nodded. Every few months, well-dressed, Eastern accents. They take a room here sometimes, but mostly meet Harrow at the saloon. She leaned forward slightly. They're not the sort of men who belong in a place like Copper Creek, if you take my meaning. Too fine for a mining town with no future. Samuel absorbed this information, adding it to the mental map he'd been constructing. If his suspicions were correct, these visitors were representatives of the organization he sought, men who coordinated the transportation of merchandise along the western routes. And Emma, what do you know about her? Mrs. Patterson sighed. Margaret, that was her mother, came to Copper Creek about 4 years back. No husband, just her and Emma. She took in washing, did mending, worked hard. Pretty woman, educated too. Could read and write better than most in these parts. Within 6 months, Harrow was courting her. We all thought it strange Margaret was gentle, refined in her way. Harrow's about as gentle as a rattlesnake. But times were hard, and a woman alone with a child. She trailed off. And after the marriage, Margaret faded like a flower without water. Started coughing, lost weight. Then, one night, there's a commotion at their cabin. Next morning, Harrow's telling everyone she fell down the stairs, broke her neck. Buried her before sundown. Mrs. Patterson's eyes hardened. I don't know what really happened, but I know what I believe. And no one questioned it. Sheriff wrote it up as an accident. Case closed. Samuel nodded slowly, the familiar anger burning in his gut. One more corrupt official, one more injustice buried, one more life discarded. The frontier was built on such stories. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Patterson added, her voice dropping. The child's sick. Consumption, I think. I've seen it before. My sister died of it years back. The cough, the weight loss, the fever that comes and goes. Don't know how far along it is, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Tuberculosis. The disease that had claimed thousands of lives across the frontier, where medical care was primitive and sanatoriums a luxury for the wealthy. Samuel had seen it devastate communities, had watched strong men waste away to nothing over months of suffering. Has she seen a doctor? Mrs. Patterson snorted. Doc Williams charges cash money, and Harrow spends whatever he doesn't drink on those fancy cigars he smokes. Besides, what would be the point? Not like there's a cure. There wasn't, Samuel knew. Some recovered, especially with rest, good food, and clean air, but many, too many, did not. I've kept you long enough, Mrs. Patterson said, rising from her chair. You've paid for the girl's room. What happens tomorrow is your business. As she walked away, Samuel remained at the table, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. What had started as a simple intervention on behalf of a mistreated child had suddenly become more complicated. Emma was ill, possibly dying. Harrow was connected to the very organization Samuel had been tracking, and now he'd placed himself squarely in the middle of a situation that threatened to derail his carefully laid plans. The logical course of action was clear: walk away. Find another lead, another entry point into the organization. Emma's suffering, while tragic, was not unique on the frontier. Getting entangled would only compromise his mission, delay his vengeance. And yet, when he closed his eyes, it wasn't Emma he saw, but William, his son, who would have been 15 now if he'd lived. William, who had trusted his father to keep him safe. William, whose small body had been buried in a casket. Samuel couldn't bear to look inside. With a muttered curse, Samuel pushed back from the table. He needed airspace to think. He left a coin for the coffee and stepped out onto the boarding house porch. Night had fully descended on Copper Creek. The main street lay quiet, most activity now centered around the saloon at the far end. A few lamps burned in windows, but many buildings stood dark, businesses that had closed when the mines began to fail, homes abandoned by families seeking better prospects elsewhere. Samuel lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the darkness. The familiar ritual did little to calm his churning thoughts. He'd spent 10 years focused on a single purpose, finding and punishing those responsible for Catherine and William's deaths. Every decision, every action had been in service of that goal. The thought of deviating, of allowing himself to be distracted by another child's plight, felt like a betrayal of their memory. And yet walking away from Emma felt equally impossible. He was so lost in thought that he didn't immediately notice the small figure that had appeared beside him, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. "You're sad," Emma said, her voice startling him from his reverie. Samuel quickly composed his features. "Thought you'd be asleep by now." "Can't sleep in strange places." She leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the deserted street. "Too many shadows." There was something in the way she said it that gave Samuel pause. Not the fear of a child afraid of the dark, but something deeper, more specific. "What do you see in the shadows, Emma?" She glanced up at him, surprised by the question. Most adults would have dismissed her concerns, told her not to be silly. After a moment, she replied, "People sometimes. People who aren't really there." "Ghosts?" Samuel asked, keeping his tone neutral. Emma shook her head. "Not ghosts. Just people who have gone away but haven't left." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Mr. Harrow says I'm touched in the head, that Mama filled it with foolishness and fairy tales. And what do you think?" She considered this, her small face solemn in the dim light from the boarding house windows. "I think there are things most people don't see because they don't want to, or can't." It was the kind of statement that could be dismissed as childish imagination, yet the certainty in her voice gave Samuel pause. Before he could respond, Emma continued, "You look like her drawing." "Whose drawing?" "Catherine's." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. He stared at Emma, unable to form words for several heartbeats. Finally, he managed to ask, "What did you say, Catherine?" Emma repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She told me you would come. She showed me your face in a dream, so I would know you." Samuel's mind raced. It had to be a coincidence. Catherine was not an uncommon name. Or perhaps Harrow or someone else in town had mentioned his past, and the girl was playing some kind of cruel game. "How do you know that name?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Emma didn't flinch. "She told me. She said you would help me, that you would understand about the shadows and the people in them." She tilted her head, studying him. "She has kind eyes, like yours used to be, before the fire took them away." Samuel felt as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. The cigarette fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "This isn't funny," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Who told you about my wife?" "No one told me," Emma said simply. "She did. Catherine. She stands behind you sometimes with her hand on your shoulder. And the little boy, William, he holds her other hand." Amada stepped back, shock giving way to anger. "That's enough," he snapped. Go back to bed." For the first time, Emma looked uncertain, even afraid. "You don't believe me?" "I believe someone's been filling your head with stories to play a very cruel joke." Emma shook her head vigorously. "No one here knows about them. I only started seeing Catherine after I got sick. She said, when the consumption starts eating your lungs, it sometimes opens your eyes to things other people can't see." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "She said to tell you that the last thing she whispered before the smoke took her was that she forgave you, that it wasn't your fault." Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. No one could have known that not the exact words Catherine had reportedly whispered to a neighbor who'd tried in vain to reach her and William in the burning station house. Words Samuel had clung to in his darkest moments, and also rejected as the well-intentioned lie of someone trying to ease his guilt. "How could you possibly know that?" he whispered. "I told you." Emma said, her voice gentle now as if she were the adult comforting a confused child. "She told me." Samuel found himself at a crossroads of belief. The rational part of his mind, the detective who had relied on evidence and deduction, rejected Emma's claims as impossible. People didn't communicate from beyond the grave. The dead were dead. And yet, there was something in Emma's eyes, a clarity, a certainty that was difficult to dismiss. And how else could she have known Catherine's last words? Before he could formulate a response, Emma swayed slightly, one hand going to her chest. A cough racked her small frame deep and wet. When she drew her hand away from her mouth, Samuel saw the telltale spots of blood on her palm. The metaphysical questions of ghosts and messages from beyond were instantly forgotten. Samuel crouched beside her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "How long have you been coughing up blood?" he asked urgently. Emma wiped her palm on the blanket, trying to hide the evidence. "A few weeks," she admitted. "It's not so bad in the daytime." It was a familiar progression: the night sweats, the weight loss, the cough that grew worse after sunset. Samuel had seen it before in mining camps and frontier towns where the disease spread like wildfire through cramped quarters. "You should be resting," he said, guiding her toward the door. "We can talk more tomorrow." Emma resisted slightly. "You think I'm making it up about Catherine?" Samuel sighed, choosing his words carefully. "I think you believe what you're saying, but I also think fever can make people see things that aren't there." "When she said you might not believe at first," Emma replied, not argumentative but matter-of-fact. "She said to tell you about the blue jar, the one with seashells that you brought her from San Francisco, the one that broke the day William was born." Again, Samuel felt that vertiginous sense of the world tilting beneath him. The blue jar had been a private joke between them, a cheap souvenir he'd bought on his first trip to California. Catherine had treasured it far beyond its worth, filling it with shells they'd collected on a rare vacation to the coast. It had indeed shattered the day William was born. Catherine had knocked it off the bedside table during a particularly difficult contraction. No one in Copper Creek could have known that detail. It hadn't been significant enough to mention to colleagues, wasn't the kind of thing that would have been reported in a newspaper after their deaths. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he repeated, unable to process the implications of Emma's knowledge. "After you've rested." This time she allowed him to lead her back inside, though she cast one more searching look at his face before disappearing up the stairs. Left alone again, Samuel found himself trembling slightly. He'd come to Copper Creek seeking justice, perhaps redemption. Instead, he'd found a child who claimed to speak with his dead wife, who knew things she couldn't possibly know. It was too much to accept, too incredible to believe. And yet, as he stood in the cool night air, Samuel found himself whispering, "Catherine, are you really here?" Only silence answered him, broken by the distant piano music from the saloon and the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness. He remained on the porch for a long time, lost in memories and doubts, before finally returning to his room at the Golden Nugget. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with dreams of Catherine calling his name from behind a wall of flame he couldn't breach. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the last remnants of the earlier rainstorm having moved on during the night. Samuel rose early, his years on the trail having conditioned him to wake with the sun, regardless of how little sleep he'd managed. After washing and shaving with cold water from the basin in his room, he dressed and made his way downstairs. The Golden Nugget was quiet at this hour, most of its patrons still sleeping off the previous night's excesses. Bart was nowhere to be seen, replaced behind the bar by a bleary-eyed young man who barely acknowledged Samuel's exit. The town was beginning to stir as Samuel walked toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Shopkeepers unlocked doors, a wagon loaded with supplies rumbled past, and two women with baskets over their arms greeted each other outside the general store. Ordinary life in a frontier town, continuing regardless of personal dramas or supernatural claims. Mrs. Patterson was serving breakfast to a handful of guests when Samuel entered. She nodded toward an empty table without interrupting her conversation with a traveling salesman. Samuel took a seat, glancing around for Emma, but seeing no sign of her. After a few minutes, Mrs. Patterson approached with a pot of coffee and a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Girl's still sleeping," she said without being asked. "Left her be. Probably the first good night's rest she's had in months." Samuel nodded his thanks both for the information and the food. As he ate, he considered his options. His original plan had been to establish himself in Copper Creek, perhaps find work that would allow him to observe the comings and goings at the saloon, to identify the well-dressed Eastern men Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, and eventually to trace them back to their superiors. Emma complicated things. If she truly was ill with consumption, she needed rest, good food, and clean air, none of which she would get living with Clayton Harrow or working in a smoke-filled saloon. But beyond the immediate concern for her welfare, there was the unsettling matter of her claimed communication with Catherine and William. Samuel had spent the night alternating between rational explanations and wild speculation. Perhaps someone in town knew more about his past than he realized. Perhaps Emma was unusually perceptive, picking up on details he'd unconsciously revealed. Or perhaps, and this was the possibility he both feared and longed for, perhaps she really could see and hear the dead. "You look like a man wrestling with his conscience," Mrs. Patterson observed, returning to refill his coffee cup. "Or with the devil himself." Samuel managed a tight smile. "Something like that." As she studied him for a moment, then said, "Whatever you're planning for the girl, you should know that Harrow's been asking after her. Came by at dawn demanding to know if she was here." Samuel tensed. "What did you tell him?" "That it was none of his business who stayed in my establishment." Mrs. Patterson's thin lips curved in a satisfied smile. "He didn't take it well, but he knows better than to make a scene here. I've got a shotgun under the counter, and I know how to use it." "He'll be back." "Counting on it," she agreed, "which is why you need to decide what happens next. You can't keep the girl here indefinitely, and I won't turn her back over to that monster." Before Samuel could respond, a small figure appeared in the doorway to the dining room. Emma, her hair freshly combed, and wearing what appeared to be one of Mrs. Patterson's shawls over her too large nightgown, looked smaller and more vulnerable in the morning light. Dark circles shadowed her eyes despite her night of rest, and her complexion had the waxy pallor characteristic of those in consumption's grip. She hesitated when she saw Samuel's uncertainty flickering across her features. He realized she was waiting to see if he was still angry about their conversation the previous night. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "There's breakfast," he said, his voice gentler than usual. Relief washed over Emma's face, and she crossed to the table, climbing onto the chair with the careful movements of someone conserving energy. Mrs. Patterson placed a plate before her, smaller portions than Samuel's, but still more food than the child had likely seen in one sitting for some time. "Eat slowly," the older woman advised. "Your stomach needs to remember what regular meals feel like." When Mrs. Patterson had moved away to attend to other guests, Emma looked up at Samuel, her expression solemn. "Are you still mad about last night?" she asked directly. Samuel considered his answer carefully. "Not mad," he said finally. "Confused, uncertain." Emma nodded, accepting this. "Catherine said you would be. She said it took you a long time to believe in anything you couldn't see or touch, even when you were married to her." There it was again, that impossible knowledge of intimate details. Catherine had indeed teased him about his literalness, his need for concrete evidence before accepting anything. "Emma," Samuel began, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know how you know these things about my wife, but I told you," she interrupted, her voice patient but firm. "She told me. She's standing right beside you now. She has her hand on your shoulder like she always does when you're worried." Samuel involuntarily glanced to his right half, hoping to see Catherine there. Of course, there was nothing but empty air. "I know you can't see her," Emma continued. "Most people can't. But she's there. So is William, though he doesn't talk as much. And my mama sometimes. And others. Others." Emma nodded, taking a small bite of eggs before answering. "Lots of others. People who died in the mines. A woman who hanged herself in the room above the general store. 2 little children who got the fever last winter." She shuddered slightly. "Some aren't nice. Some are angry or sad or lost. Those are the ones in the shadows I told you about." Samuel tried to process this. If, and it remained a massive, if Emma truly could perceive the dead, what did that mean? Were the deceased actually present, unseen by most, but somehow visible to this child? Or was she perceiving something else? Memories, impressions, echoes of lives once lived. "When did this start?" he asked. "Seeing the people who aren't there." "After I got sick," Emma replied. "It started with Mama. I was coughing so hard one night, and then she was just there, sitting on my bed, stroking my hair like she used to." Her voice softened with the memory. "At first I thought I was dreaming, but she came back night after night, and then others started appearing too." "And Catherine, when did you start seeing her?" "About a month ago. She was different from the others, clearer, stronger somehow. She said she'd been looking for someone who could see her, who could deliver a message to you." Emma paused, studying Samuel's face. "She said she's been following you for years, trying to get you to stop blaming yourself. Trying to get you to live again." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd long suppressed. "And William," he managed to ask. "He's quiet, like I said, but he smiles a lot. He has your eyes." Emma tilted her head as if listening to something Samuel couldn't hear. "He says to tell you he still has the wooden horse you carved for him. He carries it everywhere." The wooden horse, a crude thing Samuel had whittled during a long train journey given to William on his 4th birthday. The boy had treasured it, insisted on keeping it by his bed at night. It would have been with him at the station waiting for his father's return. Samuel pushed back from the table abruptly, needing space air. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. "Excuse me," he muttered, and strode toward the door. Outside, he leaned against the porch railing, drawing deep breaths of the cool morning air. His mind raced, seeking rational explanations, finding none that satisfied. Either Emma was perpetrating an elaborate deception, for what purpose he couldn't imagine, or she genuinely believed what she was saying, or, most disturbing and most hopeful of all, she was telling the truth. He became aware of Mrs. Patterson standing beside him, her expression unreadable. "The girl upset you," she observed. Samuel shook his head. "Not her fault. She just knows things she shouldn't be able to know." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, then said, "My grandmother had the sight. Could tell when someone was going to die. Could sometimes hear voices no one else heard." She shrugged at Samuel's surprised look. "Most frontier families have stories like that. People isolated from society, living close to the edge of survival, they notice things others miss." "You believe her?" "I believe she believes it," Mrs. Patterson replied carefully. "And I've lived long enough to know there's more in this world than can be explained by science or reason." She fixed Samuel with a penetrating gaze. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" It was the question he'd been avoiding since finding Emma in that alley. What was his responsibility here? To justice, to vengeance, to a dying child who claimed to speak with his dead wife. Before he could formulate an answer, the sound of raised voices came from the street. Samuel turned to see Clayton Harrow striding toward the boarding house, his face flushed with anger, or drink, or both. Behind him walked a tall man in a badge, Sheriff Morrison, presumably looking decidedly uncomfortable with the situation. "That's her," Harrow shouted, pointing at the boarding house. "The man who took her is in there too." The sheriff placed a restraining hand on Harrow's shoulder. "Let's handle this civilized like Clayton. No need for a scene." Mrs. Patterson moved to stand beside Samuel, her spine straight as a ramrod. "Here comes trouble," she muttered. "Whatever you decide, I'll back your play. Just don't get blood on my porch. It's a devil to clean." Samuel nodded, squaring his shoulders, as Harrow and the sheriff reached the bottom of the steps. He'd faced down worse than a drunken bully and a compromised lawman. But as he prepared for confrontation, he found himself wondering what Catherine would advise, if she truly was standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder. The thought gave him an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time in years, Samuel felt as if he weren't facing his battles alone. "You," Harrow snarled, jabbing a finger at Samuel. "You took my property." "Property." Samuel's voice was deceptively quiet. "I wasn't aware children were property in Colorado territory." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip, more for reassurance than threat. He was a middle-aged man, running to fat, with a drooping mustache and eyes that couldn't quite meet Samuel's. "Mr. Blackwood, is it? I'm Sheriff Elias Morrison. There seems to be a misunderstanding here. Mr. Harrow is the legal guardian of Emma Harrow, and he's mighty concerned about her whereabouts." "No misunderstanding," Samuel replied evenly. "I found Mr. Harrow about to burn the child with a lit cigarette last night. I intervened and brought her somewhere safe." Morrison's gaze shifted uncomfortably. "Well, now, discipline in a family is a private matter." "Discipline?" Mrs. Patterson interrupted, her voice sharp as a whip crack. "Is that what we're calling child abuse in Copper Creek these days, Sheriff? Because I've seen the marks on that girl's body, and they go well beyond any reasonable definition of discipline." Morrison flushed. "Mrs. Patterson, with all due respect, you'll find no respect here. Elias Morrison," she cut him off. "Not after you looked the other way when Margaret died. Not after you've let this monster terrorize her daughter for years." Harrow surged forward, only to be restrained by the sheriff. "The girl is mine," he shouted. "Legally mine. And I want her back now." "Why?" Samuel asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath. "So you can work her to death, so you can collect whatever pittance she earns and drink it away. Or is there another reason you're so desperate to get her back, Mr. Harrow?" Something flickered in Harrow's eyes, a wariness, a calculation. "Don't know what you're implying," he muttered. "I think you do," Samuel pressed. "I think Emma knows things you'd prefer stayed hidden. About Margaret's death, perhaps. Or about your errands for those Eastern gentlemen who pass through town." Harrow's face paled slightly, confirming Samuel's suspicion. Emma was valuable to him not just as a source of income, but as a keeper of secrets. "Sheriff," Harrow appealed, "are you going to let this stranger interfere with my legal rights? The girl is my responsibility by law." Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between his obligation to Harrow and the public scrutiny of Mrs. Patterson and the gathering crowd of curious onlookers. "Mr. Blackwood," he said finally, "while I appreciate your concern for the child's welfare, the law is clear. Unless you can prove Mr. Harrow is unfit as a guardian." "I can prove it," came a small voice from the doorway. All heads turned to see Emma standing there, her thin frame wrapped in Mrs. Patterson's shawl, her face pale but determined. "Emma," Harrow said, his tone suddenly solicitous, "you're not well. Come home now, and we'll forget this nonsense." Emma shook her head, taking a step forward to stand beside Samuel. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice stronger than Samuel would have thought possible. "And I can prove you're unfit. I can tell them what really happened to Mama." A flash of fear crossed Harrow's face, quickly replaced by calculated concern. "The child is delirious," he said to Morrison. "Fever affecting her mind. She needs to be home in bed." "I'm not delirious," Emma insisted. "I saw what you did to Mama. I saw you push her down the stairs when she tried to stop you from taking me away. I saw you standing over her body, making sure she was dead." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Margaret Harrow's death had been accepted as a tragic accident, but suspicions had always lingered. "The ravings of a sick child," Harrow scoffed, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning. "If they dig up Mama's body," Emma continued relentlessly, "they'll find her neck wasn't broken from falling. They'll find it was broken by your hands." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Emma, that's a serious accusation, and not the only one I can make," Emma interrupted, her gaze fixed on Harrow. "I can tell them about the men who come to our cabin at night, about the children who arrive in wagons and leave on the eastbound train, about the money you count after they're gone." Absolute silence fell over the crowd. What Emma was describing was child trafficking, a crime even the frontier's loose moral code couldn't tolerate. Harrow's face contorted with rage. "Lying little witch!" he spat, lunging forward. Samuel stepped in front of Emma, one hand moving to his revolver. "That's close enough," he warned. For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then, unexpectedly, Harrow's expression shifted. The rage drained away, replaced by a cold, calculating look that Samuel found far more disturbing. "Fine," Harrow said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Keep her for now, but this isn't over." He turned to Morrison. "Sheriff, I expect you to uphold the law. I'll be filing formal charges of kidnapping." With that, he turned and strode away, the crowd parting to let him pass. Sheriff Morrison lingered, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "a word of advice. Clayton Harrow has friends in this town, influential friends. If I were you, I'd consider moving on. Take the girl if you must, but get her far from Copper Creek. It was as close to an admission of the town's corruption as the sheriff was likely to give. Samuel nodded once, understanding the warning for what it was. As Morrison departed and the crowd began to disperse, Samuel turned to Emma, who was leaning against the porch railing, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. "You were brave," he told her. "Braver than most grown men I've known." She offered a wan smile. "Catherine told me to be. She said you'd protect me if I spoke the truth." The casual reference to his dead wife still unsettled Samuel, but less so than before. Whether Emma's visions were real or imagined, her courage was undeniable. "Come inside," Mrs. Patterson urged, placing a supportive arm around Emma's shoulders. "You need to rest." As the older woman led Emma back into the boarding house, Samuel remained on the porch, considering what had just transpired. Emma's accusations against Harrow had confirmed his suspicions. The man was indeed connected to the child trafficking network Samuel had been tracking for years. More than that, he was an active participant, possibly using his remote cabin as a way station for children being transported east. If Samuel's theory was correct, the well-dressed Eastern men who periodically visited Copper Creek were the same ones who had ordered Catherine and William's deaths when Samuel's investigation got too close to their operation. The same ones who had likely orchestrated similar eliminations of threats across the Western territories. He was closer than he'd been in years to the men responsible for destroying his family. Justice or vengeance was within reach. But now there was Emma to consider. A child who was ill, possibly dying, who needed protection and care. A child who claimed to speak with Catherine and William, who knew things she couldn't possibly know. Samuel gazed down the street where Harrow had disappeared. The man would return, he had no doubt. With reinforcements, perhaps, or with some legal maneuver designed to reclaim control of Emma. Time was limited, decisions needed to be made. As if in answer to his unspoken question, a soft breeze stirred the air around him. For just a moment, Samuel could have sworn he felt the gentle pressure of a hand on his shoulder and caught the faintest hint of Catherine's favorite lavender water. "What would you have me do, Catherine?" he whispered to the empty air. "What's the right path here?" No audible answer came, of course, but as he turned to go back inside, Samuel felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. His path forward for the moment at least was clear. Emma needed protection. Harrow and his associates needed to be stopped. And if pursuing those goals meant confronting the organization that had taken Catherine and William from him, then perhaps justice and protection could be served together. With a renewed sense of purpose, Samuel entered the boarding house to tell Emma of his decision. They would leave Copper Creek, but not to run away. Rather to find a safe haven where Emma could rest and recover, and from which Samuel could launch his final reckoning with the men who had destroyed so many lives. What he didn't yet realize was how intertwined their fates had already become, or how Emma's mysterious abilities would soon reveal secrets that would shake the foundations of everything Samuel believed about the past, the present, and the world beyond the veil of death. Dawn broke over the eastern hills as Samuel and Emma left Copper Creek behind. They traveled light, Samuel on his sturdy bay gelding, Emma seated before him wrapped in a wool blanket Mrs. Patterson had insisted they take. The older woman had also provided food for the journey medicines for Emma's cough and information about the road ahead. "Willow Springs is about 2 days' ride," she'd told Samuel as they prepared to depart. "Decent folk there. Ask for the Zimmermans, Hinrich and Greta. German couple. Lost 3 children to consumption back in the old country. They'll understand." Samuel had thanked her, pressing extra money into her hand despite her protests. for the trouble we've caused you." Mrs. Patterson had snorted at that. "Trouble's been brewing in this town long before you arrived, Mr. Blackwood. About time someone stirred the pot." Her expression had softened as she looked at Emma. "You take care, child. Mind what Mr. Blackwood tells you, and don't you worry about Harrow. He shows his face around my establishment again, he'll be looking down the barrel of my shotgun." Their departure had been timed deliberately early enough to avoid most of the town's eyes, but not so early as to appear like a furtive escape. Samuel had no illusions about Harrow letting them go easily. The man had too much at stake, and Emma knew too much. But Samuel had calculated that it would take time for Harrow to marshal whatever forces he could command, time they could use to put distance between themselves and Copper Creek. Now, as the sun climbed higher in a sky washed clean by the recent rains, Samuel felt Emma relax slightly against him. She had been tense during their departure, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if expecting pursuit. But with each mile that passed, some of that tension eased. "We're really leaving," she said, wonder in her voice. "I never thought I'd get away from him." "He won't hurt you again." Samuel promised, the words coming more easily than he'd expected. 10 years of emotional isolation had left him unaccustomed to making commitments to others. Yet with Emma, the promise felt right necessary even. They followed the old stage road for the first few hours, the track still clearly visible despite the declining traffic as the railroad had gradually replaced stage travel in many areas. By midday, however, Samuel turned them onto a lesser-used trail that wound through the foothills. "Longer this way," he explained when Emma questioned the change, but less likely to be followed. She nodded, accepting his judgment without protest. They stopped briefly to rest the horse and eat some of Mrs. Patterson's provisions. Cold biscuits, dried beef, and apples that were slightly past their prime, but still sweet. Emma ate slowly, methodically, as if still unsure when her next meal might come. As she finished her apple core and all she asked, "Where are we going, really?" Samuel considered how much to tell her. Finally he said, "First to Willow Springs, like Mrs. Patterson suggested. After that, California, maybe. The air's cleaner there, better for your lungs." Emma studied him with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. "That's not all, though. You're hunting someone." It wasn't a question. Samuel wondered if this insight came from her apparent ability to see the dead, or simply from a child's heightened awareness, honed by years of navigating a dangerous home. "Yes," he admitted. "The men Harrow works for. They took something from me a long time ago." "Catherine and William," Emma said softly. Samuel nodded, still uncomfortable with her knowledge of his past, but less resistant to it now. 10 years ago, I was investigating disappearances along the railway. Children, mostly. I got too close to whoever was behind it. They burned down the station house, where Catherine and William were waiting for my train." His voice grew tight. "I've been tracking them ever since." "And now you think Harrow is part of it. Not just part of it, a key piece." Samuel shifted in the saddle, adjusting the reins. "The children you mentioned, the ones who arrive in wagons and leave on trains, they're being transported east, sold most likely to wealthy families looking for servants, or to factories needing cheap labor, or—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the more sinister fates that might await trafficked children. Emma, however, seemed to understand. "Or worse," she finished for him. "I heard things at night. Harrow talking to those men from back east. About special orders and particular tastes." She shuddered slightly. "He was going to send me away soon. Said I was getting to the right age." Cold fury bloomed in Samuel's chest at the confirmation of his suspicions. Harrow wasn't just an accessory to child trafficking, he was actively preparing to sell Emma into it. "That's not going to happen," he said, the steel in his voice matching the determination in his heart. "Not to you, not to any other child, if I can help it." Emma turned slightly to look up at him, her expression solemn. "Catherine says that's why you found me. Why she led me to you. To help stop them, but also to help you find peace." Samuel wasn't sure how to respond to that. The idea that Catherine's spirit had somehow orchestrated their meeting was too fantastic to fully accept, yet too comforting to entirely reject. "Catherine talks to you often?" he asked instead. Emma nodded. "Almost every night. More since we left Copper Creek. She says she's been waiting a long time for you to be ready to hear her." She paused, considering. "It's not like regular talking, more like feelings and pictures that turn into words in my head." "And William, does he speak to you too?" A smile flitted across Emma's face, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her. "Sometimes. He's shy, but curious. He wants to know everything about you, what you've been doing all these years, where you've traveled." Her smile faded. "He misses you, but he says he understands why you couldn't see him before." The lump that formed in Samuel's throat made speech impossible for several moments. The thought of his son, his bright, inquisitive William, somehow watching over him through the years of grief and vengeance, cut deeper than any knife. "Tell him," Samuel began, then stopped, unsure what message he could possibly send to a child who had died, waiting for his father's return. "Tell him I miss him too. Every day." Emma nodded, as if transmitting the message immediately. After a moment she said, "He already knows." They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, as the trail wound higher into the foothills. The landscape changed gradually, the scrubby plains giving way to scattered pines and juniper. The air grew cooler, scented with resin and wild sage. As the afternoon waned, Emma began to cough more frequently, deep racking spasms that left her breathless and occasionally speckled her handkerchief with blood. Samuel made the decision to make camp earlier than he'd planned, finding a sheltered hollow near a small spring. He helped Emma dismount, noting with concern how the exertion of the day's travel had drained her. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing labored even between coughing fits. "Rest," he told her, spreading Mrs. Patterson's blanket on a patch of soft grass. "I'll get a fire going." Emma sank onto the blanket without protest, a measure of how truly exhausted she must be. Samuel busied himself gathering firewood and preparing their campsite, keeping one eye on Emma and the other on their surroundings. He had no reason to believe they'd been followed, but caution had become second nature over his years on the trail. With a small fire crackling and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot, Samuel turned his attention to Emma's medical needs. Mrs. Patterson had provided a mixture of herbs for Emma's cough-wild cherry bark mullein and honey, and instructions for preparing it as a tea. "It won't cure her," Mrs. Patterson had warned, "but it might ease the coughing, help her rest." Samuel steeped the herbs as directed, then brought the steaming cup to Emma, who had propped herself against a fallen log, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Drink this," he said, placing the cup in her small hands. "It should help with the cough." Emma sniffed the brew cautiously, then took a tentative sip. "Sweet," she observed with mild surprise. "Mama used to make something similar, but it tasted terrible." The casual mention of her mother reminded Samuel of how little he actually knew about Emma's life before Harrow. "Your mother," he said carefully. "What was she like?" Emma's face softened with memory. "Kind, smart. She could read and write better than most anyone in Copper Creek. She taught me too, though we had to hide it from Mr. Harrow after they married. He said education was wasted on girls. How did she end up with someone like Harrow? Emma stared into her cup, as if reading answers in the swirling liquid. Times were hard after Papa died. We came west because Mama heard there were opportunities for women in the growing towns teaching positions clerical work. But Copper Creek wasn't what she expected. The mines were failing, families leaving. No one wanted to pay for a teacher. She took another sip of tea before continuing. We were almost out of money when Mr. Harrow started calling. He owned land, had a solid cabin. Seemed respectable enough at first. Mama didn't love him, I know that now, but she thought he'd provide for us. A shadow crossed her face. He changed after the wedding. Started drinking more. Got mean. And then your mother died, Samuel prompted gently when Emma fell silent. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. 6 months after the wedding. Mr. Harrow wanted to send me away, said there was a school back east that would take me. Mama refused. They argued. I was supposed to be asleep. But I heard everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He pushed her down the stairs. I saw it from the landing. He stood over her afterward, making sure she was dead. The matter-of-fact way Emma recounted her mother's murder broke something in Samuel's heart. No child should have to witness such violence, let alone describe it with such resigned acceptance. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Who would believe me? Mr. Harrow told everyone it was an accident. The sheriff was his friend, and he said if I told he'd do worse to me than he did to Mama." Emma shrugged, a gesture too old for her young shoulders. "So I learned to be quiet, to be useful, to stay out of his way when he'd been drinking." Samuel thought of all the adults in Copper Creek who must have seen the signs, the bruises, the fear, the gradual wasting away of a child in their midst, and looked the other way. His contempt for the town deepened. "You're safe now," he said, knowing it wasn't enough, but needing to say it anyway. Emma gave him a look that was far too knowing. "For how long I'm dying, Mr. Blackwood? I know that. Mrs. Patterson knows it too, though she didn't say it outright." The blunt assessment delivered in a child's voice caught Samuel off guard. "You don't know that for certain," he argued. "Plenty of people recover from consumption with proper care." "Not this far along," Emma said with that same eerie certainty. "Catherine told me. She said my time is short but important." She set down her empty cup and looked directly at Samuel. "That's why I need to help you find the men who killed her and William, before it's too late." Samuel stared at her, momentarily speechless. This child, this dying child, was offering to help him pursue his decade-long quest for vengeance. The absurdity of it struck him first, followed quickly by a wave of shame. What kind of man was he to even consider involving a sick child in his dangerous obsession? "Emma, that's not why I brought you with me," he said firmly. "My business with those men is my own. Your only concern should be resting and getting better." She shook her head, stubborn despite her frailty. "It's why we found each other. Catherine says so. And Mama agrees. They both want the same thing for those men to be stopped before they hurt more children." "And what do you want?" Samuel countered. The question seemed to surprise her, as if no one had ever bothered to ask her desires before. After a moment's reflection, she said, "I want to matter. Before I go, I want to have done something important." Her gaze, steady and unflinching, met his. "Isn't that what everyone wants in the end?" Samuel had no answer to that. He busied himself preparing their simple dinner: beans, salt pork, and the last of Mrs. Patterson's biscuits, while Emma dozed by the fire, the herb tea having eased her cough temporarily. As night fell in earnest, wrapping the foothills in a blanket of darkness, relieved only by their small fire and the canopy of stars overhead, Samuel found himself contemplating Emma's words. To matter. To have made a difference, however small, in the grand scheme of things. Wasn't that what had driven him these past 10 years? Not just vengeance, but a desperate need to give meaning to Catherine and William's deaths, to ensure they hadn't died in vain. Perhaps he and Emma weren't so different after all. He was about to wake her for dinner when she stirred on her own, sitting up and rubbing her eyes like a much younger child. For a moment, Samuel could see the little girl she must have been before hardship and illness had aged her prematurely. "I had a dream," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "About Sarah." "Sarah?" Emma nodded, accepting the tin plate Samuel offered her. "She was one of the children Mr. Harrow sent away, about a year ago. Pretty girl with yellow hair. She cried the whole time they were at our cabin." She picked at her beans listlessly. "I see her sometimes in my dreams. She's trying to tell me something, but I can't always understand." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept up Samuel's spine. What did she say in this dream? That there are others. Other children being held somewhere near here, waiting to be sent east. Emma looked up from her plate, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "She says we need to find them." Samuel set his own plate aside, appetite gone. If Emma's dream was accurate, if her apparent ability to communicate with the dead extended to victims of the trafficking operation, it could provide crucial information for dismantling the network. But it could also be the fever-induced imagination of a sick child, or worse, a trap. "Did Sarah say where these children are being held?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Emma shook her head. "Not exactly. She showed me a place, a barn, I think, with a red door, and mountains behind it." She frowned in concentration. "There was a windmill, too, broken, missing some of its blades." It wasn't much to go on, but it was more specific than Samuel had expected. A red-doored barn near a broken windmill somewhere in the foothills. It could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius, or it could be a complete fabrication. "I'll keep an eye out," he promised, not committing to more than that. Emma seemed satisfied with his response. She ate a few more bites of her dinner before setting the plate aside. "I'm not very hungry," she apologized. "You need to keep your strength up," Samuel urged, but didn't push when she shook her head. "Tell me about Catherine," she said instead. "What was she like when she was alive?" The question caught Samuel off guard. For years he'd avoided speaking of Catherine, as if saying her name aloud would somehow make the pain of her loss fresh again. But now, sitting across a campfire from a child who claimed to speak with her spirit, the impulse to share memories was unexpectedly strong. She was extraordinary. He began the word inadequate, but the only one that came to mind. Smart, educated, could have taught at any school in the country, but chose a frontier classroom because she believed every child deserved learning, not just those in cities. As he spoke, memories long suppressed rose to the surface. Catherine laughing as they danced at their wedding. Catherine reading aloud by lamplight, her voice bringing characters to life. Catherine kneeling to explain some wonder of nature to William, her patience infinite. She had this way of seeing the best in people. Samuel continued, his voice softening. Even me, especially when I couldn't see it myself. And courage, not the showy kind, but the quiet strength that gets people through hard times. Emma listened intently, a small smile playing at her lips. "She's still like that," she said when Samuel paused. "Strong, kind. She worries about you, though. says you've been lost since the fire." Samuel couldn't deny it. He had been lost, wandering both physically and spiritually, his only compass the burning need for justice or vengeance. He hardly distinguished between the two anymore. "And William?" he asked, hungry now for details of the son who would forever be 5 years old in his memory. "What do you see in him?" Emma's smile widened. "He's curious about everything, always asking questions. Catherine says he gets that from you, the need to know how things work, why things happen." She tilted her head as if listening to something Samuel couldn't hear. "He says to tell you he's sorry he broke your pocket watch, the one with the engraving inside. He was just trying to see the gears." Samuel felt his breath catch. The silver pocket watch had been a gift from his father, engraved with the family motto, "Seek truth, speak truth." William had indeed broken it just weeks before the fire, attempting to peer inside at the mechanism. Samuel had been angry at first, then resigned. He'd meant to have it repaired, but after the fire, it hadn't seemed important. He hadn't thought about that watch in years, had certainly never mentioned it to anyone in Copper Creek. "How could you know that?" he whispered. "I told you," Emma replied patiently. "William told me. He's been watching over you along with Catherine. They never left you, not really." The concept was simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. Had Catherine and William truly been present through his decade of grief and obsession? Had they witnessed his descent into the bottle, his cold-blooded tracking of their killers, the gradual hardening of his heart? "I wish I could see them," he admitted, the words escaping before he could reconsider. "You can," Emma said, her expression earnest. "Not like I do, maybe. But they say there are other ways. Dreams, feelings, moments when you know they're near, without knowing how you know." Samuel thought of the times he'd felt Catherine's presence most strongly, a scent of lavender on the wind, a sudden warmth in a cold room, the inexplicable urge to turn down one road instead of another. Had those been her attempts to reach him? "Catherine says the veil between worlds is thinner in some places," Emma continued. "And for some people, like me, because I'm close to crossing over myself, and sometimes for people who've experienced great loss or love. Is that why you can see them, because of your illness?" Emma nodded. "It started after the coughing got bad. First Mama, then others. Catherine says when consumption eats away at your lungs, it sometimes opens your eyes to things other people can't see." She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I was scared at first, but now it's almost a gift, knowing I won't be alone when the time comes." The simple acceptance in her voice brought a lump to Samuel's throat. Here was a child facing death with more grace and courage than he had faced life these past 10 years. "Get some rest," he said, unable to continue the conversation without betraying more emotion than he was comfortable showing. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Emma nodded, settling down on her makeshift bed near the fire. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, already half asleep. "Good night, Emma," he replied softly. Long after she had drifted off, Samuel remained awake, staring into the dying embers of their fire and pondering the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a solitary man with a single purpose. Now he found himself responsible for a sick child who claimed to speak with the dead, including his dead wife and son. More unsettling still was the realization that he was beginning to believe her. They reached Willow Springs late the following afternoon, having made slower progress than Samuel had hoped. Emma's condition had worsened overnight, her cough more frequent, and her fever higher. Several times Samuel had considered turning back to Copper Creek, where at least there was a doctor, however mercenary. But the risk of encountering Harrow outweighed the potential benefits, and Emma herself had insisted on continuing forward. "There's nothing for me back there," she'd said during one of their rest stops, her voice raspy from coughing. "Better to die on the road to somewhere than live in that cabin another day." Willow Springs proved to be less a town than a trading post, a cluster of buildings surrounding a natural spring that bubbled up from beneath a massive willow tree that gave the place its name. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small inn, and a handful of houses were all that constituted the settlement. But after a day and a half on the trail, it looked like civilization indeed. The inn was a two-story structure of weathered wood and stone, with a sign hanging over the door that read simply, "Zimmerman's." As Samuel helped Emma dismount, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Apron spotlessly white despite the frontier setting. "Guten Tag," she greeted them, her German accent still strong, despite what must have been years in America. Her shrewd eyes took in Emma's condition at a glance, and her expression softened. "The child is ill. Bring her inside quickly." Samuel didn't question the welcome, merely gathered Emma in his arms. She was alarmingly light, and followed the woman into the inn. The interior was surprisingly cozy, with polished wooden floors, curtains at the windows, and the delicious aroma of something baking in the kitchen. "Heinrich," the woman called, "prepare the blue room. We have guests." A tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard appeared from a back room, nodding at his wife's instructions before disappearing up a narrow staircase. "I am Greta Zimmerman," the woman informed Samuel as she led them to a small sitting room off the main hall. "My husband and I own this establishment. Please sit. The child needs rest." Samuel settled Emma on a comfortable sofa near the fireplace, where a small fire took the chill from the air, despite the relatively mild day outside. Emma's eyes were bright with fever, her breathing labored. "Thank you for your hospitality," Samuel began, but Greta waved away his words. "No need for formalities. Mrs. Patterson sent word you might be coming this way. She spoke highly of you, Mr. Blackwood, which is not something she does lightly." Greta bent to examine Emma more closely, her expression grave. "Consumption, yes, advanced from the look of it." Samuel nodded, surprised by the directness. "You have medical training." A shadow crossed Greta's face. "Experience, not training. We lost 3 children to the disease in Bavaria before coming to America." She placed a cool hand on Emma's forehead. "This child has perhaps months, not years, but we will make her comfortable, Ja, and you will tell us the full story of how you came to be traveling with her." It wasn't a request, but a statement. Samuel found himself respecting the woman's no-nonsense approach. Heinrich Zimmerman returned, announcing that the room was prepared. Without waiting for further discussion, Greta scooped Emma into her arms with surprising strength and headed for the stairs. "I will settle her with tea and medicine," she said over her shoulder. "Heinrich will show you where to stable your horse and bring your belongings. Then we will talk." Within the hour, Emma was installed in a clean, airy room on the second floor. Greta had administered a mixture of herbs similar to Mrs. Patterson's, but with additions from her own garden, and Samuel found himself seated at the Zimmerman's kitchen table, a plate of hearty stew before him and 2 expectant faces across the table. He told them everything, or nearly everything. About finding Emma in the alley behind the Golden Nugget, about Harrow's abuse, and the suspicions regarding Margaret's death, about the evidence of child trafficking through Copper Creek. He omitted only Emma's claims about seeing the dead, uncertain how the Zimmermans would react to such information. Heinrich and Greta listened without interruption, their expressions growing increasingly grave. When Samuel finished, Hinrich leaned forward, his heavily accented English deliberate and precise. "You have made dangerous enemies, Mr. Blackwood. Clayton Harrow is known to us by reputation, if not personally. He works for men who do not tolerate interference." "I'm aware of the risks," Samuel replied. "But I couldn't leave the child in that situation." "Of course not," Greta agreed. "No decent man could, but you must understand these men, these child stealers, they have connections throughout the territory. Money in the right pockets, threats in the right ears. They will come looking for you and for the girl." "Let them come," Samuel said, the cold determination that had driven him for a decade surfacing in his voice. "I've been hunting them for years. Maybe it's time they hunted me for a change." Hinrich and Greta exchanged a look loaded with meaning. Finally, Hinrich nodded, as if a decision had been reached. "You and the child may stay here as long as necessary," he said. "We have room and few guests this time of year. But you should know that you are not the first to pass through Willow Springs fleeing these men." Samuel's interest sharpened. "Others have come this way." Greta nodded. "Over the years, yes. Sometimes families searching for missing children. Sometimes lawmen following rumors. Sometimes," she hesitated, "sometimes the children themselves, those who managed to escape." "What happened to them?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Those who continued their investigations disappeared," Hinrich said bluntly. "Those who were wise enough to abandon their quests lived to return home, though without the answers or justice they sought. And the children who escaped. We helped them as we could," Greta said. "New Names Passage further west, sometimes all the way to California. New lives away from those who would exploit them." Her eyes grew hard. "We have our own reasons for hating these men beyond the natural revulsion any decent person would feel." Samuel sensed there was more to their story, but he didn't press. Everyone on the frontier carried secrets, burdens from past lives. He of all people understood the desire to keep some wounds private. "I appreciate your help," he said instead, "for Emma's sake, if nothing else. The child is welcome here for as long as—" Greta didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. "For as long as she has." "There's something else you should know," Samuel added after a moment's consideration. "Emma believes or claims that she can communicate with the dead, specifically with her mother, and with my wife and son, who died 10 years ago." He watched their reactions, carefully prepared for skepticism or worse. To his surprise, neither Zimmermann showed particular shock at the revelation. Hinrich merely nodded thoughtfully, while Greta crossed herself, a gesture that seemed more respectful than fearful. "The dying often see beyond the veil," Hinrich said. "It is known. As they prepare to cross over, they sometimes glimpse what awaits them, or who." "You believe her?" Samuel couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Why should we not?" Greta returned. "We have seen much in our lives, Mr. Blackwood, things that cannot be explained by reason or science. The world is full of mysteries, and the boundary between life and death is perhaps the greatest of them." Their acceptance, or at least their lack of outright dismissal, eased something in Samuel's chest. He had been carrying the weight of Emma's revelations alone, uncertain how to reconcile them with his rational understanding of the world. "She's had dreams," he said, deciding to trust the Zimmermanns fully. "About other children being held somewhere in this region. A barn with a red door near a broken windmill. Does that mean anything to you?" Hinrich and Greta exchanged another significant look. "Perhaps," Hinrich said cautiously. "There is a place about half a day's ride into the foothills north of here. An abandoned homestead with a barn that matches that description." "The McNally place," Greta clarified. Family died of fever 3 winters back. Property's been empty since, or so most believe. But you think otherwise. Hinrich shrugged his broad shoulders. There have been rumors. Lights seen at night. Wagons coming and going. Nothing certain you understand, but enough to make one wonder. I need to see this place, Samuel said, the familiar sense of purpose rising within him. Not tonight, Greta said firmly. The child needs you here, and you need rest yourself. Tomorrow is soon enough to go chasing ghosts and rumors. Despite his impatience, Samuel knew she was right. He was exhausted from the journey, and Emma's condition required attention. Moreover, approaching an unknown location at night, potentially occupied by hostiles, would be foolhardy. Tomorrow, then, he agreed. But I'll need directions. Better than directions, Hinrich said. I will take you myself. I know the trails, and 4 eyes are better than 2 for such an expedition. Samuel started to protest. This was his fight, not Hinrich's, but the older man raised a hand to forestall him. It is decided, he said with finality. Now eat your stew before it grows cold. Greta will never forgive me if I let a guest go hungry at our table. The conversation turned to lighter topics after that. The weather, local news, the Zimmermans' journey from Bavaria to America years ago. But beneath the casual exchange, Samuel sensed the couple's determination to help him and Emma, and their own deep-seated hatred for the men who trafficked in children's lives. Later, after the meal was finished, and Hinrich had retired to his workshop to repair a piece of harness, Greta led Samuel upstairs to check on Emma. The girl was sleeping peacefully. Her breathing still labored, but less desperate than earlier. Her face flushed with fever, but relaxed in slumber. The herbs help with the symptoms, but they cannot cure what ails her, Greta said softly as they stood in the doorway watching Emma sleep. You understand this, yes. Samuel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Mrs. Patterson said the same. She will have good days and bad, but the direction is only one way. Greta's voice was gentle but unflinching. The question is not whether she will die, but how she will live in the time that remains, and what purpose her life will serve. She's just a child, Samuel protested. She shouldn't need to serve any purpose beyond being a child. Perhaps, Greta conceded, but fate has dealt her a different hand, and from what you have told me, she has chosen to use her remaining time to help you find justice for your family and protection for other children. She placed a weathered hand on Samuel's arm. Do not discount her choice out of a misplaced desire to protect her from what cannot be avoided. With that, she left him alone with the sleeping Emma, her words echoing in his mind. Was he wrong to try to shield Emma from involvement in his dangerous quest? Or was he denying her the very thing she wanted most, the chance to matter, to make a difference before her time ran out? Samuel settled into a chair beside Emma's bed, prepared to watch over her through the night. As the hours passed and the household grew quiet around him, he found himself studying the child's face, searching for answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct. Her hand lying atop the quilt twitched slightly, as if reaching for something or someone only she could see. Catherine, she whispered the word, barely audible. I see them, the children. Samuel leaned forward, not wanting to wake her, but desperate to hear more. Where, Emma? He whispered back. Where are the children? Red door. Emma murmured, her eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. Sarah says, hurry, coming soon. Then she subsided back into deeper sleep, her breathing evening out, leaving Samuel with more questions than answers. He must have dozed off himself at some point, for he woke with a start to find early morning light filtering through the curtains, and Emma watching him from the bed, her eyes clearer than they had been the previous day. "You stayed all night," she observed, surprise, and something like pleasure in her voice. Samuel straightened in the chair, working the stiffness from his neck. "Wanted to make sure you were comfortable," he said, slightly embarrassed to have been caught sleeping on duty, as it were. "I was talking to Sarah in my dreams," Emma said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "She showed me more about the place where the children are. There's a well behind the barn and a line of 3 pine trees on a ridge above the property." Samuel nodded, filing away these details to share with Hinrich. "The Zimmermans think they know the place. We're going to investigate today." Alarm flashed across Emma's face. "I need to come with you." "Absolutely not," Samuel said firmly. "You need rest, and the journey could be dangerous." "But I can see things you can't," Emma insisted, struggling to sit up. "Sarah says there are hidden places, secrets you might miss without me." "Emma," Samuel began, prepared to be stern, but she cut him off. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, this is why I'm still here, still alive. To help these children. Sarah says there are 6 of them, all younger than me, scared and hungry and waiting for someone to find them." Her eyes filled with tears. "If we wait too long, men will come to take them away. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Please." Samuel hesitated, torn between his desire to protect Emma and the urgent need to rescue the captive children, if they existed at all. Before he could respond, Greta appeared in the doorway, a tray of breakfast in her hands. "The child is right," she said, having clearly overheard their conversation. "If her dreams speak true, there may be little time." She set the tray on a small table and turned to Samuel. "I have a wagon. Heinrich can drive with the child made comfortable on blankets in the back. You can ride alongside. It will be slower than horses alone, but safer for her. Mrs. Zimmerman, with all due respect, Emma is very ill, and will be no less ill resting here than resting in a wagon," Greta interrupted. "If there are indeed children being held at the McNally place, every hour may matter. Would you deny her the chance to help save them when she has so few chances left for anything?" Put that way, Samuel found his arguments crumbling. He looked at Emma, whose determined expression belied her physical frailty, and felt a reluctant admiration for her courage. "If and only if Dr. Zimmerman agrees, it won't worsen your condition," he conceded finally. "And at the first sign of trouble, you stay with the wagon while we investigate. No arguments." Emma nodded eagerly, relief washing over her features. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret it." But as Samuel left to find Hinrich and discuss their plans, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a grave mistake. Taking a desperately ill child into potential danger went against every protective instinct he possessed. Yet Greta's words echoed in his mind. Would you deny her the chance to help save them when she has so few chances left for anything? Perhaps this was what Catherine had meant, speaking through Emma about finding purpose. Perhaps this mission, this chance to save other children from the fate that had nearly claimed Emma herself, was exactly what both of them needed to find a measure of peace. With renewed determination, Samuel set about preparing for the journey to the McNally homestead, unaware that the day's events would reveal secrets far beyond the whereabouts of missing children, secrets that would force him to confront not only the men responsible for Catherine and William's deaths, but the deepest, darkest parts of his own soul. The journey to the McNally homestead took longer than anticipated. Though Hinrich had initially estimated half a day's travel, the need to move slowly for Emma's comfort stretched the journey well into the afternoon. The wagon Greta had mentioned proved to be a sturdy farm wagon, its bed lined with straw and blankets to create a makeshift sickbed for Emma. The girl had protested initially. "I'm not an invalid," but her strength had visibly flagged as they prepared to depart, and she had ultimately accepted the arrangement with as much dignity as an 11-year-old could muster. Samuel rode alongside, alternating between scanning their surroundings for potential threats and checking on Emma's condition. Despite the discomfort of travel, she seemed energized by their mission, her eyes bright with purpose, if not health. As they traveled, Hinrich shared what he knew of the McNally family and their homestead. "Good people," he said, his hands steady on the reins. "John McNally, his wife, Mary, 3 young children. Came west for land and opportunity like so many. Built a solid place, house, barn, good well. Started a small orchard that was just beginning to bear fruit." "What happened to them?" Samuel asked, though he could guess from Greta's earlier comment about fever. "Influenza," Hinrich confirmed. "Swept through these parts 3 winters back. The McNallys were hit hard. No one knew how sick they were until it was too late, isolated, as they were especially in winter. By the time a neighbor checked on them, all 5 were gone." He shook his head sadly. "We helped bury them. Proper Christian burial all together on their own land. No relatives came forward to claim the property, so it stood empty since." "Or supposedly empty," Samuel amended. Hinrich nodded grimly. "First rumors started about a year ago. Lights seen at night. Wagon tracks where no wagons should be. Some trappers claimed they heard children crying, but when they investigated the next day, the place was deserted." "Why didn't anyone report these incidents to the authorities?" Hinrich gave him a look that spoke volumes about the realities of frontier justice. "What authorities? Mr. Blackwood, nearest sheriff, is in Cedar Ridge, 2 days' ride in good weather. And even if he came, what would he find? Empty buildings, perhaps a few wagon tracks that could be explained away as hunters or travelers seeking shelter." Samuel couldn't argue with the logic. He knew all too well how easy it was for criminals to operate in the vast, sparsely populated territories of the West, where law enforcement was thin and often corrupt. "Besides," Hinrich added, his voice lowering, "there are rumors that the sheriff in Cedar Ridge has been paid to look the other way when certain wagons pass through his jurisdiction. Rumors only you understand, but enough to make folks hesitant to involve him." Another corrupt lawman. Samuel's disgust with the system that had failed so many deepened. If not for men like Sheriff Morrison and this unnamed Cedar Ridge sheriff, how many children might have been saved from trafficking? How many families, including his own, might have remained intact? They fell silent as the trail narrowed, winding through increasingly rugged terrain. The foothills rose around them, pine and spruce replacing the scattered juniper of the lower elevations. The air grew cooler, tinged with the scent of resin and damp earth. Midway through the afternoon, they crested a rise, and Hinrich drew the wagon to a halt. "There," he said, pointing to a small valley below. "The McNally place." Samuel reined in his horse beside the wagon and surveyed the scene. The homestead lay nestled in a natural bowl formed by surrounding hills partially sheltered from wind and weather. A small cabin stood near the center, its windows dark and shuttered. Behind it stretched a young orchard, the trees still slender but healthy, a testament to the care the McNally family had invested in their dream. And there, set slightly apart from the house, was a barn with a red door, just as Emma had described in her dream. Beside it stood a windmill, several of its blades, indeed, missing, the remaining ones hanging motionless in the still air. "See the ridge beyond the barn," Hinrich murmured. 3 pine trees standing alone. Samuel nodded, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air creeping up his spine. Every detail matched Emma's description, a description she claimed had come from the spirit of a dead girl named Sarah. "We need to get closer," he said, "but carefully. If there are people using this place, they may have posted lookouts. There's a back way in, Hinrich offered, through that draw to the east. It adds time, but it's sheltered from view of the homestead until the last quarter mile. Samuel considered their options. Direct approach would be faster but potentially dangerous if hostiles were present. The indirect route Hinrich suggested would be safer but slower, and time might be critical if children were indeed being held captive. Before he could decide, Emma's voice came from the wagon bed, weak but determined. "We need to hurry. Sarah says they're coming tonight. Men with wagons to take the children away." Samuel glanced at Hinrich, who nodded gravely. "We'll take the direct approach, but stop in that stand of trees halfway down," Samuel decided. "I'll go ahead on foot to scout, while you stay with Emma and the wagon." "I should come with you," Emma protested, attempting to sit up. "We had an agreement," Samuel reminded her firmly. "You stay with the wagon at the first sign of danger. This qualifies." She subsided reluctantly, but not before adding, "Sarah says to check the well first. There's something there you need to see." Amisi filed away the instruction, though he wasn't entirely comfortable taking direction from the purported spirit of a dead girl. Still, Emma's knowledge of the homestead's details had proven accurate so far. It seemed foolish to dismiss her guidance now. They proceeded down the slope toward the homestead, tension mounting with each yard gained. Samuel found himself constantly scanning the surroundings, one hand never far from his revolver. The place had an eerie stillness about it, not the peaceful quiet of an abandoned homestead, but the held-breath tension of a place where something was not quite right. As agreed, they halted in a small grove of trees about halfway to the buildings. Samuel dismounted, checked his weapons, the Colt revolver at his hip, and a Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard, and prepared to continue on foot. "Give me 2 hours," he told Heinrich. "If I'm not back by then, return to Willow Springs and send word to the authorities in Denver. Not the local sheriff, but the federal marshal's office. Ask for Marshal Jameson specifically and tell him it concerns the railway kidnappings from 10 years ago." Hinrich nodded, his expression grave. "God go with you, Mr. Blackwood." Emma reached out from her nest of blankets to catch Samuel's hand. Her fingers felt too warm, her grip too weak. "Be careful," she whispered. "Sarah says there's evil in that place, not just men, but something darker." The warning delivered in her childish voice sent another chill through Samuel. "I'll be careful," he promised, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. With a final nod to Heinrich, Samuel set off through the trees, moving from cover to cover with the practiced stealth of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. As he drew closer to the homestead, he studied it with a tracker's eye, noting details that might escape a casual observer. The cabin's shutters were indeed closed, but one hung slightly askew, as if recently disturbed. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, so faint it was almost invisible against the cloudy sky, but present nonetheless. Someone had lit a fire in the hearth, and recently. The barn's red door was closed, secured with a padlock that gleamed too brightly to have weathered 3 years of mountain storms, new then, or at least recently installed. Most telling of all were the tracks in the yard between buildings, multiple sets of footprints, some small enough to belong to children, and the distinctive wheel marks of wagons that had come and gone within the past few days. Emma's dream, or Sarah's message, appeared to be accurate. The McNally homestead was being used, and given the presence of childlike footprints, possibly as a holding facility for trafficked children. Following Emma's instructions, Samuel made his way to the well that stood between the house and barn. It was a simple structure, stone lined with a wooden cover and a hand crank for raising the bucket. Nothing about it seemed unusual or worthy of special attention. He was about to move on when he noticed something half hidden in the grass beside the well, a small object that caught the afternoon light. Kneeling, Samuel discovered a child's doll crudely made from scraps of fabric, but obviously treasured, judging by the worn spots where small hands had clutched it. As he lifted the doll, a scrap of paper fell from its makeshift dress. Samuel unfolded it carefully, revealing a child's drawing in charcoal, a stick figure adult, with an angry face. Several smaller figures huddled together, and what appeared to be a wagon. Beneath the drawing were scrawled the words, "Help us," in uneven capital letters. A message from one of the captive children hidden in the hope that someone might find it. Samuel's jaw tightened with anger and renewed determination. The evidence was clear now. Children were being held here frightened and desperate for rescue. Pocketing the note and doll, Samuel continued his reconnaissance, circling the barn first. The padlock on the main door would be difficult to breach without tools or noise, but he discovered a smaller side door secured only with a simple latch. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he caught glimpses of the barn's interior stalls that had been converted to makeshift cells, bedding on the floor, a bucket in the corner of each enclosure for sanitation. Empty now, but clearly designed to hold human captives. The cabin proved more informative. Samuel approached from the rear, using the orchard trees for cover. Through a gap in the ill-fitting shutters, he could make out the cabin's interior, a single room with a table, chairs, and several pallets spread on the floor. A pot bubbled over a small fire in the hearth, and on the table lay papers, including what appeared to be a ledger. Most significantly, the cabin was not empty. A man sat at the table, his back to the window, apparently absorbed in the paperwork before him. Though Samuel could see only his back, something about the set of the shoulders, the way the man held his pen, struck a chord of recognition. He shifted position carefully, trying to get a better angle without revealing his presence. As the man inside turned slightly to reach for something, his profile came into view, and Samuel felt his blood run cold. He knew that face. Not Clayton Harrow, as he might have expected, but someone from much further back in his past. Thomas Blackwood, Samuel's own brother, believed dead for 15 years. The shock nearly caused Samuel to lose his footing. He steadied himself against the cabin wall, mind racing to process this impossible revelation. Thomas, his elder brother by 5 years, had reportedly died in a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi in 1872. There had been a funeral, though, with no body recovered, only an empty casket, lowered into the family plot. Yet, here he was, very much alive, apparently involved in the very child trafficking operation. Samuel had been hunting the operation responsible for Catherine and William's deaths. Could it be a mistake? A look-alike? A coincidence? Samuel strained for another glimpse, doubt and disbelief warring with the evidence of his own eyes. The man inside stood stretching and turned fully toward the window. There could be no mistake now. Despite the years, despite the scar that hadn't been there before cutting across his right cheek, it was undeniably Thomas, Samuel's brother, his only living relative, or so he had believed until Thomas's death. The implications staggered him. Had Thomas faked his death? Had he been involved in child trafficking even then? And most horrifying of all, had he known about Catherine and William? Had he been complicit in their murders? A wave of nausea washed over Samuel, followed by a cold fury unlike anything he had experienced in his decade of seeking vengeance. If Thomas was involved, if he had known about, or God forbid, ordered the deaths of Samuel's wife and son, he forced himself to breathe, to think. Rushing in now, driven by emotion, would be a mistake. He needed more information needed to understand Thomas's role in all this before confronting him. The sound of approaching horses snapped Samuel back to the present danger. He ducked lower, using the cabin as cover, as he peered around the corner toward the main trail. 3 riders approached the homestead, dust rising from their horses' hooves as they made their way down the slope. Even at a distance, Samuel recognized the center figure, Clayton Harrow, his bulky form unmistakable even on horseback. The other 2 men were strangers to Samuel, but their bearing and dress suggested hired guns rather than business associates muscled to provide protection during whatever transaction was planned for the evening. Thomas emerged from the cabin at the sound of the approaching riders, shading his eyes against the late afternoon sun. "You're early," he called as the men drew near. "We weren't expecting you until after dark." "Change of plans?" Harrow replied, dismounting heavily. "Had some trouble back in Copper Creek. Needed to move up the timetable." "Trouble?" Thomas's voice sharpened. "What kind of trouble?" Harrow spat into the dust. "Girl got away. Emma. The one I told you about who saw too much. And you let her escape." Thomas's tone was dangerously quiet. "Not just escaped. Taken. By some drifter named Blackwood." Samuel saw his brother go very still at the mention of the name. "Blackwood," Thomas repeated carefully. "Samuel Blackwood." Harrow nodded, oblivious to the significance. "That's the one. Interfering bastard took her right out from under my nose. Sheriff Morrison was no help, spineless as always." Thomas paced a few steps, visibly processing this information. "And where is this Blackwood now? Where did he take the girl?" "Don't know for certain. Headed west out of Copper Creek, according to what little Morrison could discover. Could be anywhere by now." Thomas cursed softly, then seemed to come to a decision. "We move the merchandise tonight as soon as it's fully dark. The buyers will have to adjust their expectations." He turned to the 2 hired guns. "You 2 check the barn. Make sure everything's secure. Harrow with me. We need to discuss contingencies." As the men dispersed to their assigned tasks, Samuel retreated further into the orchard, mind racing. The merchandise Thomas referred to had to be the children Emma had seen in her dreams, children who would be transported tonight to meet buyers, their fates sealed unless Samuel intervened. But now he faced an impossible dilemma. The revelation of Thomas's involvement complicated everything. This was no longer just about stopping anonymous criminals or even avenging Catherine and William. This was family blood betraying blood in the most heinous way imaginable. Samuel needed time to think, to plan. He needed to return to Hinrich and Emma to regroup and decide on a course of action that would both rescue the captive children and deal with the shocking discovery of his brother's treachery. Moving as quietly as possible, he began making his way back through the orchard toward the stand of trees where Hinrich waited with the wagon. Each step felt leaden-weighted, not just with the urgency of their mission, but with the devastating knowledge he now carried. His own brother, his flesh and blood. A child trafficker, possibly a murderer, certainly complicit in untold suffering. As Samuel reached the edge of the orchard, a twig snapped behind him. He froze, then began to turn, hand moving toward his revolver. Too late. Something hard connected with the back of his head, sending pain exploding through his skull, and darkness rushing in from all sides. His last conscious thought was of Emma waiting with Hinrich for his return, counting on him to save those children. Emma, who would never understand why he didn't come back. Then blackness claimed him, and Samuel Blackwood knew no more. Consciousness returned to Samuel in painful increments. First came the throbbing ache at the base of his skull, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Then the awareness of cold, hard ground beneath him, the smell of damp earth and old hay. Finally, the muffled sounds of movement and low voices nearby. He kept his eyes closed instinctively, avoiding any indication that he had awakened. Years of dangerous work had taught him the value of gathering information before revealing vulnerability. Still say we should just kill him and be done with it, a voice was saying. Harrow's Samuel recognized. "He's nothing but trouble." "That's not your decision to make," came the reply. Thomas, his brother, the man who should have been 15 years dead. "We follow protocol. Always." "Protocol?" Harrow scoffed. "He's seen your face. He knows about the operation. Protocol would say, eliminate the threat." "I determine what protocol dictates in this situation," Thomas replied, his tone icy. "He stays alive until I've questioned him." A third voice entered the conversation, unfamiliar with the cultured accent of an educated Easterner. "I must concur with Mr. Harrow in this instance, Thomas. This man represents an unacceptable risk. Our investors have been quite clear about the importance of discretion." "I'm well aware of the investors' concerns, Mr. Caldwell," Thomas responded, "but this particular interloper may have valuable information that could lead us to the girl who escaped and to anyone else she might have spoken to." A pause. Then Caldwell again. "Very well. Question him. But do so quickly. The wagons will be loaded and ready to depart within the hour." Footsteps retreated. A door opened and closed, and then silence fell. Samuel kept his breathing even, fighting against the urge to open his eyes. He needed to understand his situation before making any move. He was bound, that much he could tell from the pressure of rope around his wrists and ankles. Lying on what felt like a dirt floor, likely inside the barn. The air was cool but not frigid, suggesting it was still evening rather than deep night. How long had he been unconscious? An hour more. Hinrich and Emma would be worried by now, perhaps already considering whether to follow Samuel's instructions to flee if he didn't return. Emma. The thought of the sick child waiting in vain for his return twisted something in Samuel's chest. She had trusted him, believed in him, and now he had failed her, just as he had failed Catherine and William 10 years ago. "I know you're awake, Samuel." Thomas's voice, closer now, shattered the pretense. Samuel opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light of a lantern hanging from a nearby beam. He was indeed in the barn, lying on the packed earth floor of what had once been a stall. His hands were bound behind him, his ankles tied as well, though not connected to his wrists. Small mercy. Thomas sat on a wooden crate a few feet away, watching him with an expression Samuel couldn't quite decipher. "Hello, brother." Thomas said the familiar endearment, a mockery under the circumstances. "It's been a long time." Samuel struggled to sit up, managing to prop himself against the stall wall. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his skull, but he refused to show weakness. "Not long enough," he replied, his voice rough from dryness. "I thought you were dead." "Yes, that was rather the point." Thomas smiled thinly. The steamboat explosion provided a convenient exit from a life that had become restrictive. "Restrictive," Samuel repeated, contempt evident in his tone. "Is that what you call having a wife, a respectable business, a family who loved you, a wife who didn't understand me, a business that was failing, and a family—" Thomas paused, something flickering in his eyes, before his expression hardened again. "A family that was better off without me, as events have proven." Samuel stared at the stranger wearing his brother's face, trying to reconcile the Thomas he had known, serious, responsible, sometimes stern, but fundamentally decent, with the man before him now, a man involved in the trafficking of children in untold suffering. "How long?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than its two words suggested. "How long have you been this person? How long have you been involved in this evil?" Thomas seemed to understand the layers of the question. "I became involved with the organization shortly after the war," he said, referring to the Civil War that had ended over 20 years earlier. I met certain individuals during my time in the Quartermaster Corps who recognized my potential. They made me an offer when I returned home. I declined initially. What changed? Reality changed, Thomas replied with a shrug. The business began to fail. Martha became increasingly dissatisfied with our circumstances. I realized that the moral high ground is a cold and barren place. He leaned forward slightly. But enough about ancient history. I'm more interested in recent events, like how my supposedly retired brother turned up investigating one of my operations. Samuel considered his options. Thomas clearly didn't know the full extent of his quest, didn't realize that Samuel had been hunting this organization for a decade. That ignorance might be useful. I wasn't investigating anything, he said. I was passing through Copper Creek and intervened when I saw Harrow abusing a child. One thing led to another. Thomas studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the plausibility of this account. The child, Emma Harrow. Where is she now? Safe, Samuel replied tersely. Beyond your reach. Few things are truly beyond our reach, Samuel. The organization has resources you can scarcely imagine: financial, political, informational. If we want to find this girl, we will.
Why do you care about one sick child? From what I gather, your organization has plenty of merchandise to traffic. Samuel couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. Emma Harrow is a loose end, Thomas said. She has knowledge that could prove inconvenient if shared with the wrong people. Harrow should have handled the situation more discreetly, but here we are. He sighed, almost regretful. And now you've involved yourself creating yet another problem requiring resolution. Resolution, Samuel repeated. Is that what you call murder these days? A flicker of something annoyance guilt crossed Thomas's face. I haven't decided your fate yet, brother. That depends largely on your cooperation. Tell me where the girl is, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement that doesn't end with your death. Samuel laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You're trafficking children, Thomas, selling them to God knows who for God knows what purposes. And you think I'd betray a child to you to save my own skin? You never knew me at all. Perhaps not, Thomas conceded. But I do know that everyone has their breaking point. He stood adjusting his coat with the meticulous care Samuel remembered from childhood. I'll give you some time to consider your options. The wagons leave tonight. Your fate will be decided before then. As Thomas turned to leave, Samuel called after him, unable to contain the question burning in his throat. Were you part of it? The fire at Denver Station? The one that killed Catherine and William? Thomas paused, his back to Samuel. For a long moment he stood perfectly still. Then, without turning, he said, You should never have married her, Samuel. She made you weak. With that he was gone, the barn door closing behind him with a decisive thud, leaving Samuel alone with the devastating implication of his brother's non-answer. Thomas had known about Catherine and William's deaths, had possibly ordered them or at least been complicit in the decision. His own brother had been party to the murder of Samuel's family. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, reopening grief that Samuel had thought scarred over years ago. He closed his eyes, fighting against the wave of rage and despair threatening to overwhelm him. Focus, he told himself sternly. Rage wouldn't free him from these ropes. Despair wouldn't save the children still held captive. And neither would help Emma waiting with Hinrich in the grove of trees, perhaps already wondering whether to flee or attempt a rescue. Samuel twisted his wrists, testing the ropes. They were professionally tied tight enough to secure not so tight
as to cut off circulation. Escape would not be easy, but neither was it impossible. He had been in worse situations during his years as a railway detective. As he worked at the bindings, a new sound caught his attention, a faint scratching at the barn's side door, the one he had discovered during his reconnaissance. Samuel went still, listening intently. The scratching continued, followed by the soft squeal of hinges as the door opened just enough to admit a small figure who slipped inside like a shadow. "Mr. Blackwood," came a whispered voice that Samuel recognized with a mixture of relief and alarm. "Emma," he hissed back. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." The girl crept closer, her form gradually becoming visible in the dim lantern light. She looked even more frail than when he had left her, her face pale and drawn with fatigue, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I saw them take you," she whispered, kneeling beside him and examining his bonds. "In my dream. Sarah showed me." "You shouldn't have come," Samuel insisted, though his heart lifted at the sight of her. "Harrow is here, and others. Dangerous men." "I know," Emma replied, producing a small knife from her pocket, Mrs. Patterson's paring knife, Samuel realized. "But the children are here too, in the root cellar beneath the house. Sarah showed me." As she spoke, she began sawing at the ropes binding Samuel's wrists. Her hands trembled with weakness, making the process painfully slow. "Where's Hinrich?" Samuel asked. "Creating a distraction," Emma said with the ghost of a smile. "He's circling around to the front of the property. Going to make it look like the laws arrived, he brought an old tin star from his days as a town constable back in Bavaria." Despite the gravity of their situation, Samuel felt a surge of admiration for both Emma and the old German. Outnumbered and outgunned, they had still come for him, still found a way to help. "You're a brave girl, Emma Harrow," he said softly. She paused in her cutting, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "Not Harrow," she corrected. "Never really his. My name is Emma Winters. My mother was Margaret Winters before she married him." The rope finally gave way, freeing Samuel's hands. He quickly took the knife from Emma and made short work of the bindings at his ankles. "Can you walk?" Emma asked anxiously as he rubbed circulation back into his limbs. "I'll manage," Samuel assured her, though his head still throbbed and his vision swam slightly when he moved too quickly. "But we need to get you out of here. It's not safe." Emma shook her head stubbornly. "Not without the children. Sarah says they're scared. They can feel something bad is going to happen tonight." Samuel wanted to argue, to insist that Emma's safety came first, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. This mattered to her perhaps more than her own survival. Who was he to deny her the chance to help, to make the difference she so desperately wanted to make before her time ran out? "All right," he conceded. "But you stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise." Samuel retrieved his revolver from a table where his captors had carelessly left his possessions, checking that it was still loaded. His rifle was nowhere to be seen, but the 6 shots in the Colt would have to suffice. "How many men did you see?" he asked Emma as they moved toward the side door. 4, she whispered back. "The big man Harrow. The one who looks like you." "My brother," Samuel confirmed grimly. Emma's eyes widened slightly at this revelation, but she continued without comment. "A fancy-dressed man with a walking stick, and another rough-looking man with a scar on his face. They're all in the house now, eating dinner." "And the children, you're sure they're in the root cellar?" Emma nodded. "Sarah showed me. There's an entrance inside the house through the kitchen and another outside behind the porch. It's hidden by bushes." The exterior entrance would be their best bet, Samuel decided. less chance of encountering Harrow and the others. They slipped out of the barn and into the gathering dusk, staying low and using the deepening shadows for cover. Samuel's head pounded with each movement, but he forced himself to focus, to remain alert for any sign of danger. As they skirted the edge of the yard, a commotion erupted from the front of the property, shouts the whinny of a startled horse, a man's voice calling, "U.S. Marshal, everyone out with your hands up." Hinrich's distraction, right on time. Samuel saw shadows moving in the house, figures rushing to windows, momentary confusion, buying them precious seconds. "Now," Samuel whispered, guiding Emma in a crouched run toward the back of the house. They reached the porch just as a gunshot rang out from the front warning shot, or actual fire, Samuel couldn't tell. Emma pointed to a cluster of overgrown shrubs beside the porch steps. "There," she whispered, "behind those bushes." Samuel pushed aside the foliage to reveal a slanted wooden door set into the ground, a typical root-cellar entrance for a frontier homestead. It was secured with a padlock similar to the one on the barn door. "Stand back," Samuel instructed, and when Emma had complied, he fired a single shot at the lock, the report partially masked by the continuing commotion at the front of the house. The lock shattered. Samuel pulled the door open to reveal a set of earthen steps descending into darkness. The smell that rose from below turned his stomach unwashed bodies, human waste, fear. "Hello," he called softly down the stairs. "We're here to help. Is anyone down there?" Silence greeted his call, then a small voice trembling with fear and hope. "Sarah, is that you?" Emma moved forward, peering into the darkness. "Sarah sent us," she said, her voice gentle, despite the urgency of their situation. "We're going to take you somewhere safe." A moment passed, then the sound of shuffling movement from below. Samuel struck a match, illuminating the cellar just enough to reveal its occupants, 6 children ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 10 years old, huddled together on the packed earth floor. Their clothes were dirty, their faces smudged with grime and tears, but they appeared physically unharmed. "Come," Samuel urged, extending his hand to the nearest child, a small boy with matted blonde hair. "Quickly and quietly. We have a wagon waiting." The children needed no further encouragement. They scrambled up the steps, blinking in the fading daylight, expressions of mingled fear and desperate hope on their dirty faces. "This way," Samuel directed, leading them toward the cover of the orchard. Emma brought up the rear, moving more slowly, clearly exhausted by the exertion, but determined to help. They had almost reached the first line of trees when a voice rang out behind them. "That's far enough, Samuel." Thomas stood on the porch, a rifle aimed steady at Samuel's back. Behind him, through the windows of the house, Samuel could see movement, Harrow and the others presumably having discovered that Hinrich's martial ruse was just that. Samuel turned slowly, positioning himself between Thomas and the children. "Let them go, Thomas," he said, his voice steady, despite the hammering of his heart. "Whatever you've become, you can't want this. Children sold like cattle, lives destroyed." "It's business," Thomas replied, though something in his voice lacked conviction. "Supply meeting demand. The world isn't the noble place you've always imagined, Samuel." "These are children," Samuel insisted. "Like William was a child. Does that mean nothing to you? Does family mean nothing?" At the mention of William's name, Thomas's expression flickered. "Don't speak of him," he warned. "You have no right." "I have every right," Samuel countered. "He was my son, my blood, just as you are my blood, Thomas. And I'm asking you now, as your brother, to let these children go, to end this." For a moment, just a moment, Uncertainty crossed Thomas's face. The rifle barrel dipped slightly. Then the front door of the house banged open, and Harrow burst out, followed by Caldwell and the fourth man, all armed. "What are you waiting for?" Harrow shouted. "Shoot him! Shoot them all!" The moment of connection between the brothers shattered. Thomas's expression hardened, the rifle coming back up to aim at Samuel's chest. "I'm sorry, Samuel," he said, and Samuel knew he meant it, however inadequate the sentiment. "But I made my choice long ago." Samuel tensed, preparing to dive for cover, knowing he couldn't possibly protect all the children, knowing that some, perhaps all of them, were about to die. Then something extraordinary happened. Emma stepped forward, moving to stand beside Samuel. As she did, the air around her seemed to shimmer like heat rising from summer-baked earth. A soft glow emanated from her small form, growing steadily brighter in the gathering dusk. "Stop," she said, her voice somehow different, deeper, more resonant, as if multiple voices spoke through her. "Enough blood has been spilled." Thomas froze, the rifle suddenly unsteady in his hands. "What is this?" he whispered, his face draining of color. "What trick is this?" It was no trick, Samuel realized with a mixture of awe and fear. The glow surrounding Emma pulsed gently, and within it shapes began to form, translucent figures that gradually resolved into recognizable forms. A woman with gentle eyes and auburn hair, Catherine, as beautiful as the day Samuel had lost her. Beside her, a small boy with Samuel's own determined jaw, William, forever 5 years old. And others, a woman Samuel didn't recognize, but who bore a striking resemblance to Emma, presumably Margaret Winters. A young girl with blonde braids, perhaps the Sarah of Emma's visions, and more indistinct forms hovering at the edges of perception. The spirits of the dead made visible through Emma's mysterious gift. "Catherine!" Thomas gasped, the rifle lowering further as he stared at his sister-in-law's ghostly form. "William, this isn't possible." "Yet here we are," Emma replied. Or perhaps it was Catherine speaking through her, Samuel couldn't be sure. The voices seemed to blend again. "The dead bear witness, Thomas Blackwood. The dead remember." Thomas took a step back, his face ashen. "No," he murmured. "No, you can't be here. You're gone. I made sure." He cut himself off, but too late. "You ordered the fire," Samuel said, the final piece clicking into place. "Not just complicity, direct responsibility. You gave the order that killed my wife and son." Thomas didn't deny it. He couldn't not, with Catherine and William's spirits before him, not with the evidence of his guilt written in his own horrified expression. "I never meant," he began, then stopped, seemingly unable to complete the lie. "It was business," he said instead, echoing his earlier justification. "You were getting too close to the operation. Examples had to be made." "Examples?" Samuel repeated, rage and grief threatening to overwhelm him. "They were innocent. William was 5 years old. They weren't supposed to be there," Thomas insisted, as if that somehow mitigated his crime. "The station house was supposed to be empty. A warning, nothing more. But then Catherine brought William to surprise you." He trailed off, the inadequacy of his explanation evident even to himself. Samuel's hand tightened on his revolver. One shot. That's all it would take to end the man who had ordered his family's death. One shot to avenge Catherine and William, to punish the betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. As if sensing his thoughts, Emma, or the spirits speaking through her, turned to him. "Vengeance isn't justice, Samuel," she said softly. "It won't bring them back. It won't heal your heart. He deserves to die." Samuel argued, the revolver now aimed at Thomas's chest. For what he did to them, for what he's done to countless children. Perhaps, Emma acknowledged. But is death what you truly want for your brother? Or do you want him to face the consequences of his actions, to live with what he's done? Before Samuel could respond, Harrow's patience evidently ran out. Enough of this nonsense, he growled, raising his own weapon. I don't know what kind of trick this is, but it ends now. He fired at Emma. Samuel moved without thinking, throwing himself in front of the child. He felt the bullet strike his shoulder, spinning him halfway around with the impact. Pain exploded through his body, but he managed to keep his feet to keep himself between Emma and danger. What happened next occurred so quickly that Samuel would later struggle to piece it together coherently. The ghostly figures surrounding Emma seemed to surge forward, passing through Samuel, moving toward the men on the porch with terrible purpose. Though they had no physical form, their presence affected the living profoundly. Harrow screamed, dropping his gun and clutching at his head, as if in unbearable pain. Caldwell and the fourth man turned to flee, colliding with each other in their panic. And Thomas stood rooted to the spot, staring at the approaching spirits of his sister-in-law and nephew, his face a mask of terror and guilt. "You are seen, Thomas Blackwood," Emma said, her voice still that strange blend of multiple speakers. "You are known. There is nowhere you can hide from what you've done." Thomas fell to his knees, the rifle clattering forgotten to the porch boards. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether to Catherine and William or to Samuel it wasn't clear. "God help me. I'm sorry." The commotion had drawn attention. From the direction of the trees came shouts and the thunder of approaching horses. For one confused moment, Samuel thought it must be Heinrich returning with help, but the riders who burst into the clearing wore the distinctive uniforms of U.S. Marshals, real ones this time, not Heinrich's impersonation. Federal Marshals, called the lead rider a gray-haired man, Samuel recognized with shock as his former superior, Marshal Jameson. Everyone freeze. The scene that greeted the lawmen was bizarre by any standard, Samuel bleeding from a shoulder wound, Emma glowing with otherworldly light, 6 terrified children clustered together, and 4 grown men in various states of panic or collapse. The glow surrounding Emma began to fade, the spectral figures withdrawing, becoming indistinct once more. As they vanished, Emma herself seemed to diminish the strength that had sustained her, draining away all at once. Samuel caught her as she collapsed, cradling her against his uninjured side, heedless of the marshals dismounting around them, of the shouts and confusion. "Emma!" he called urgently, her small form frighteningly still in his arms. "Emma, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, distant. "Did we save them?" she whispered. "The children." "Yes," Samuel assured her, his voice breaking. "Yes, you saved them. They're safe now." A faint smile touched Emma's lips. "Good," she murmured. "That's good." Her gaze shifted, focusing on something or someone Samuel couldn't see. "Yes, I see you now. All of you. So bright." "Emma, hold on," Samuel pleaded, feeling her slipping away even as he held her. "Help is here. We'll get you to a doctor." She shook her head slightly. "Too late for that. It's all right, Mr. Blackwood. Really." Her breathing grew more labored, each word an effort. "Catherine says to tell you she's proud of you for choosing mercy over vengeance." Tears blurred Samuel's vision. "Don't go," he whispered, knowing even as he said it that he was asking the impossible. Emma's illness had been terminal from the start, her remaining time measured in months at best. The exertion and stress of the rescue had merely hastened the inevitable. "Not going," Emma managed, her voice fading to the barest whisper. "Just crossing over. I'll be with them, with Mama, with Sarah." Her eyes found his one last time, suddenly clear and peaceful. "Thank you for making me matter." Then she was gone, her small body going limp in his arms, her last breath escaping in a soft sigh that seemed to mingle with the evening breeze. Samuel bowed his head, his tears falling unchecked onto Emma's still face. Around them, the marshals secured the prisoners, gathered the rescued children, brought order to chaos. But Samuel was aware of none of it. In that moment, his world had narrowed to the child in his arms, the brave, extraordinary child who had helped him find not just the justice he sought, but the peace he hadn't known he needed. "Samuel!" Marshal Jameson's voice broke through his grief. The older man stood beside him, his weathered face grave but compassionate. "We need to get that shoulder looked at," Jameson said gently. "And the children need attention, too." "How did you find us?" Samuel asked, not moving, not yet ready to relinquish Emma's body. "Got a telegram from Willow Springs," Jameson explained. "From a Mrs. Zimmerman. Said it concerned the railway kidnappings from 10 years back, and that you were involved. Given your history with the case, I assembled a team immediately." He glanced at Thomas, now being handcuffed by one of the other marshals. "Never expected to find Thomas Blackwood at the heart of it, though. We all thought he was dead." "So did I," Samuel said, his voice hollow. Jameson hesitated, then asked, "And the child, who was she?" Samuel looked down at Emma's peaceful face. How to explain who she had been? A victim of abuse, yes. A dying girl, certainly, but also a bridge between worlds, a messenger for the dead, a light in the darkness when Samuel had needed it most. "She was a hero," he said simply. "She saved those children. She saved me." Jameson nodded, accepting this without further question. "We'll take her back to Willow Springs," he said. "Give her a proper burial. The Zimmermans are already there. The man was headed back to town for help when we intercepted him." He placed a hand on Samuel's uninjured shoulder. "Let us help you now, Samuel. It's over." But it wasn't over, not quite. Samuel rose, carefully cradling Emma's body against his chest, despite the pain in his wounded shoulder. "I need to speak to my brother first," he said, his voice steady once more. Jameson looked as if he might object, then nodded. "Make it quick," he said. "We need to get those children to safety, and you to a doctor." Samuel carried Emma to where Thomas knelt, hands cuffed behind him, head bowed in defeat. At Samuel's approach, Thomas looked up, his expression a complex mixture of remorse, fear, and something like relief. "You won," he said simply. Samuel shook his head. This wasn't about winning or losing, Thomas. It was about justice, for Catherine and William, for Emma here, for all the children your organization has harmed over the years. Thomas's gaze fell on Emma's still form. "She was extraordinary," he said quietly. "What I saw, what she showed us, I can't explain it." "Some things defy explanation," Samuel replied. "But that doesn't make them any less real." A silence fell between the brothers, once so close, now separated by choices, by crimes, by the weight of years and the blood of innocence. "I am sorry," Thomas said finally. "For Catherine and William, not a day has passed that I haven't regretted giving that order." "Regret isn't atonement," Samuel said, his voice neither harsh nor forgiving, simply stating a truth. "You'll have the rest of your life to think about the difference." Thomas nodded, accepting this. "What will you do now?" he asked. "With your vengeance achieved your quest complete. Samuel looked down at Emma, at the face that even in death seemed to hold a hint of the otherworldly wisdom that had made her so remarkable in life. "Live," he said simply. "Honor the dead by living well. It's what Catherine would have wanted, what Emma helped me understand." With that, he turned away from his brother for the last time, carrying Emma's body toward the waiting marshals. The sun had set completely now, the valley cloaked in the soft darkness of a mountain evening. Above, stars were beginning to appear pinpricks of light in the vast canvas of the sky. Samuel thought of Emma's final words, "so bright," and wondered what she had seen in those last moments. Catherine and William waiting to welcome her, Margaret and Sarah and the others she had glimpsed during her illness, or something beyond human comprehension, a light that transcended the boundary between worlds. He would never know, not in this life. But Emma's gift had given him something precious, the certainty that death was not the end, that those he had loved and lost remained connected to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. That night, as a doctor tended his wounded shoulder in the Zimmerman's Inn at Willow Springs, as the rescued children were fed and bathed and comforted, as Thomas and his associates began the journey to Denver, in chains, Samuel found himself at peace, for the first time in a decade. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be trials, literal ones, as he testified against Thomas and the others, and figurative ones, as he learned to live with both the grief of his losses and the comfort of his newfound certainty. But it was a road he could walk now, free of the consuming need for vengeance that had driven him for so long. 3 days later, they buried Emma in the small cemetery behind Willow Springs' tiny church. It was a simple ceremony attended by the Zimmerman's Marshal Jameson, the rescued children who were well enough to attend, and Samuel, his arm in a sling, but his spirit healing in ways his body had yet to match. As the local preacher spoke words of comfort and hope, Samuel found himself thinking not of the child being laid to rest, but of the extraordinary spirit that had inhabited her frail body. Emma had lived 11 short years, much of it in fear and hardship. Yet she had faced her end with courage and compassion that humbled him. "She made herself matter," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. After the service, as the others drifted back toward town, Samuel remained by the fresh grave. The Zimmermans had commissioned a simple wooden marker carved with Emma's true name, Emma Winters, and the dates of her birth and death. Beneath, at Samuel's request, were the words, "She helped others see the light." He placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the mound of earth, kneeling despite the protest from his injured shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly to the girl who could no longer hear him, or perhaps could hear him more clearly than ever, freed from the limitations of her failing body. As he rose to leave, a strange sensation washed over him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun, a presence that was familiar, yet impossible. For just a moment, he could have sworn he caught the scent of Catherine's lavender water, heard the echo of William's laugh. And there, at the edge of his vision, a shimmer like heat rising from summer-baked earth. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing to see. Just the cemetery, the mountains beyond the endless Colorado sky. But he knew what it had been, who it had been. "I see you now," he whispered, a smile touching his lips for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Not with my eyes, perhaps. But I see you." The sensation faded gradually, leaving behind not emptiness but a fullness, a certainty that would sustain him in the days and years to come. They were with him, Catherine, William, Emma. Not lost, merely transformed. Not gone, merely waiting. Samuel turned toward Willow Springs, toward the future, carrying that certainty like a lantern in the gathering dusk. Autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson as Samuel worked, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing across the clearing. The cabin was taking shape nicely, 2 rooms so far, with plans for expansion as needed. A porch faced west, positioned to catch the sunset over the mountains. Behind the cabin, a small vegetable garden was already prepared for spring planting. The McNally homestead, or what had been the McNally homestead, was being reborn. After the trials in Denver, after Thomas and the others had been sentenced, Thomas to life imprisonment, a fate perhaps more fitting than the hanging some had called for after the rescued children had been restored to families where possible and placed in good homes where not, Samuel had returned to the valley where Emma had spent her final moments. The property had been seized by the government, its future uncertain. Marshal Jameson, perhaps feeling he owed Samuel for helping break open the trafficking ring that had operated with impunity for so long, had pulled strings to have the deed transferred to Samuel for a nominal fee. "What will you do with it?" Jameson had asked as he handed over the papers. Samuel hadn't been entirely sure at first, but as summer turned to fall, the idea had taken shape, growing clearer with each passing day. This place of darkness would become a sanctuary of light, a home for children who needed one, a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to go. The Emma Winters Home for Children, he would call it. A place where every child would matter. He'd started with the cabin, knowing that winter in the mountains would arrive soon and bring construction to a halt. The barn scene of so much suffering had been torn down, its usable lumber repurposed for the new structures, its tainted foundation buried and forgotten. Heinrich and Greta Zimmerman had supported his vision enthusiastically, offering both practical help and emotional encouragement. "We are too old to start again with children," Greta had said, "but we will help you in any way we can." And so the work progressed day by day, a future built one plank, one nail at a time. On this particular evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Samuel set aside his tools and moved to his favorite spot, a simple bench beneath the 3 pine trees on the ridge above the property. From here, he could see the entire valley, the cabin below, the winding trail that led eventually to Willow Springs. He came here often at day's end to rest, to think, and sometimes, though he would have been hesitant to admit it to anyone else, to talk to those who had gone before. Catherine, William, Emma. He felt them most strongly here at the threshold, between day and night, between earth and sky. As the sunset painted the clouds in spectacular hues of pink and gold, Samuel closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He had found his purpose again, not in vengeance, but in creation, in protection, in honoring the memories of those he had loved and lost. "I hope you can see this," he said softly to the evening air. "I hope you know that you made this possible, Emma, that you mattered, that you always will." No visible sign answered him, no spectral figures appeared as they had on that fateful night. But as the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, Samuel felt once more that sense of presence, of connection, across the boundary between worlds. They were with him, still not lost, merely transformed. Not gone, merely waiting. And in that knowledge, Samuel Blackwood found not just peace, but joy. He remained on the bench until full darkness had fallen, the valley below cloaked in shadow, the sky above ablaze with stars. Then, with a heart full of gratitude and purpose, he made his way back to the cabin that would soon be filled with children's voices, children's laughter, children's dreams. In the Valley of Souls, light had returned, and it would never again be extinguished.